Chapter 1. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 1. Boyhood. George Washington was born in the state of Virginia, at a place known as Bridges Creek, on February 22, 1732. His great-grandsire John Washington came from England in the year 1657 and took up lands in that state and was a rich man. George was the son of his grandson Augustine. Augustine's first wife was Jane Butler, who died and left him with 2 boys. His next wife was Mary Ball, and George was her first child. The old homestead in which George was born stood near the banks of the Potomac River and was built with a steep roof that sloped down to low eaves that hung out far from the main wall. There were 4 rooms on the ground floor and some near the roof, and at each end of the house was a great fireplace built of brick, with broad hearthstones such as were in style in those days. A stone is all that marks the birthplace of George Washington. He was not more than 8 years of age when his father went to live on a farm near the Rappahannock River. The house was built much in the same style as the one at Bridges Creek, but it stood on high ground, and here all his boyhood days were spent. As there were no good schools in America at the time, those who had the means sent their sons to England to be taught and trained. Lawrence Washington was sent when he was 15 years of age, and as he was the firstborn, it was thought that he would in time take his father's place as head of the house. The school to which George was sent stood in a field on his father's land, and was taught by a man named Hobby. This gave it the name of the Hobby School. There were but 3 things taught there: how to read, how to write, and how to do sums. And some folks thought that these were all their boys and girls had need to learn. Books were scarce and dear, and as most of the men raised fine crops and kept up a brisk trade, they were well pleased to have their boys learn how to buy and sell and to make out bills. George had been trained by his father, who was a strict and yet a just man, to love the truth and to do right at all times. He was made to feel that it was a sin to tell a lie, and much worse to hide a fault than to own it. George had a small axe, of which he was quite proud, and boylike he cut right and left with it, and thought not of the harm he might do. On the lawn stood a small tree, which his father hoped to see grow up to a good height and bear fine fruit. George made a great gash in this tree with his sharp axe, and when his father saw it, he was quite sad. He called the boy to his side, and in a stern voice said, "Who did this? Who cut this tree?" George hung his head with shame. He knew he had done wrong, and he stood in fear of his father, who he knew would use the rod where there was need of it. It was a chance for the boy to show what kind of stuff he was made of. George raised his face, still red with the blush of shame, and said in his frank way and without a sign of fear, "I did it, father. I cannot tell a lie." There was no need to use the rod on such a boy as that, and the father must have felt a thrill of joy when he found that the great truths he had taught his son had such a hold on his mind and had struck their roots deep into his heart. It is told that he clasped George to his breast and said with tears in his eyes that it would grieve him less to lose scores and scores of trees than to have his boy tell one lie. But you must not think that George Washington was such a good boy, that he could guide himself and did not need to be kept in check. He was high strung, as quick as a flash, and felt that he was born to rule. And these traits his mother had to keep down and train so they would not wreck the young boy. For when George was not yet 12 years of age, his father died, and his mother was left with the care of 5 young folks. The task was one for which she was well fit, and as she had rare good sense, a fine mind, a strong will, and a kind heart, she used to read to her boys and girls each day out of some good book, talk with them, and tell them how they could best serve God and man. And George laid up each word in his heart, and sought to pay her back as well as he could for all her kind love and care. She said of George that he was a good boy, and it had been said in her praise that a noble mother must have borne so brave a son. When George was 13 and his half-brother Lawrence 21, England and Spain went to war, and Lawrence went with the troops that were sent to the West Indies. The sight of Lawrence in warlike trim, the sound of drum and fife, and the march of troops through the streets fired the heart of the young lad, and from that time his plays and games, in school and out, took on a warlike turn. There was a boy at school named William Bussell, who took up arms and marched with as much zeal as George Washington. But George was at all times commander-in-chief. He was fond of all the sports that boys love. He could run and jump and climb and toss bars, and took part in all those feats that kept him in health and strength. He could pitch quoits loose in the field. He was so fierce that no one had dared to get on his back. One day George went out to view the colt with some of his boy friends, and he told them if they would help him put the bit in the colt's mouth, he would mount. The boys drove the colt into a small lot, put the bit in his mouth, and Washington was soon on his back. The beast rushed into the field, but was soon curbed by the strong arms of the boy on his back. Then the colt reared and plunged and tried in all sorts of ways to get rid of the lad, who clung to the colt's bare back as if he had been glued there. Mad with rage, the colt tried once more to throw him, but strained too hard, and fell to the ground and died in a short time. The group of boys were well scared at this sad end of their fun, and scarce knew what to do. When they went back to the house, Mrs. Washington asked the boys if they had seen her fine breed of colts. "The one I am most proud of," she said, "I am told is as large as his sire." Some of the lads hung their heads and knew not what to say, but George spoke up in his frank way and said that the colt was dead. "Dead?" she cried, "and from what cause?" Then George told her just what had been done, and how hard the beast had fought to get free, and how at the last, with one wild fierce plunge, he fell down and died. A flush rose to the mother's cheek, and then she said to her boy, "It is well, but while I grieve at the loss of my fine colt, I feel a pride and joy in my son, who speaks the truth at all times." George was fond of his books too, and was so wise a lad, and so full of thought, and had so keen a sense of what was just, that his schoolmates came to him when they got into a war of words or of blows, that he might say which side was right and which was wrong, and thus put an end to the fight. This use of his mind made George look at things in a clear light, and gave him that look of true pride which all men of high mind, the real kings of earth, are wont to wear. In due time George outgrew the hobby school, and was sent to live with his half-brother Augustine at Bridges Creek, where there was a school of a high grade. But George had no taste for Latin or Greek, and liked best to do sums and to draw maps. He wrote with great care, page after page of what he called forms of writing. These were notes of hand, bills of sale, deeds, bonds, and the like, such as one would think a boy of 13 would not care much about. In the same book, it is kept to this day, George wrote out 110 rules which were to guide him in act and speech at home and abroad. Some few of these I will give you, that you may see at how young an age this boy set out to train himself and fit himself for the high place he was to fill. It almost seems as if he must have known the high rank he was to take, but this could not be. His soul was fixed on high things. He had no low tastes, and he was led by the hand of God. Here are some of the rules that George Washington took as the guide of his youth. In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers or feet. Sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Speak not when you should hold your peace. Walk not when others stop. Turn not your back to others when speaking. Jog not the table or desk on which another reads or writes. Lean not on anyone. Read no letters, books, or papers in company. But when there is a need for doing it, you must ask leave. Come not near the books or writings of anyone so as to read them, unless asked to do so, nor give your opinion of them unasked. Also look not nigh when another is writing a letter. In writing or speaking, give to each person his due title according to his rank and the custom of the place. When a man does all he can, though it succeeds not well, blame not him that he did it. Be slow to believe evil reports of anyone. Be modest in your dress, and seek to suit nature rather than to win admiration. Keep to the fashion of your equals, such as are civil and orderly with respect to times and places. Play not the peacock, looking all about to see if you can be well decked. If your shoes fit well, your stockings sit neatly, and your clothes handsomely. Make friends with those of good character. If you care for your own reputation, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. Speak not of doleful things in time of mirth, nor at the table. Speak not of mournful things as death and wounds. And if others mention them, change, if you can, the discourse. Utter not base and foolish things mongst grave and learned men, nor hard questions or subjects among the ignorant, nor things hard to be believed. Be not forward, but friendly and courteous, the first to salute, hear, and answer, and be not pensive when it is time to converse. Gaze not on the marks or blemishes of others, and ask not how they came. Think before you speak. Pronounce not imperfectly, nor bring out your words too hastily, but orderly and distinctly. Treat with men at fit times about business, and whisper not in the company of others. Be not curious to know the affairs of others, nor go near to those that speak in private. Undertake not to do what you cannot perform, but be careful to keep your promise. Speak not evil of the absent, for it is unjust. Make no show of taking great delight in your food. Feed not with greediness. Cut your bread with a knife. Lean not on the table, neither find fault with what you eat. When you speak of God, let it be gravely and in reverence. Honor and obey your parents, although they may be poor. Let your amusements be manful, not sinful. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. It is not known where George found these rules he took so much pains to write out, but it is plain that he set great store by them and made use of them throughout his whole life. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 2. Youth.
George was a great pet with his brother Lawrence Washington, who thought it would be a nice thing for him to serve on board one of the king's ships of war. While Lawrence was in the West Indies, he was on good terms with General Wentworth and Admiral Vernon, and he had no doubt they would do their best to get his brother a good place. He spoke to George about it, and the boy was wild with joy. His mother's pride was roused with joy, and at first she did not put a straw in his way, but gave him all the help she could. But as the time drew near, her heart, which had been so strong and brave and full of pride, gave way, and she felt that she could not part with her dear boy. One of her friends wrote to Lawrence that Mrs. Washington had made up her mind not to let George go to sea. She said that some of her friends had told her it was a bad plan. "And I find," said he, that one word against his going was more weight than 10 for it. So they gave up the scheme, and George was sent back to school. He would, on fine days, go out in the fields and tracts of land around the schoolhouse, and with a line and rod take the size and shape, the length and width, and mark it all down in one of his books. And so much pains did he take that from the first to the last page not a blot or blur is to be seen. These neat ways formed in his youth were kept up through all his life. And what seems strange is that day books, and such books as you will find in great use nowadays, were not known at that time. The plan had been thought out by George Washington when a boy of 16, and shows the cast of his mind. Near this time George was sent to live with his brother Lawrence at his fine place on the Potomac,
which he had called Mount Vernon,
to show how much he thought of the admiral of that name. Here George had a chance to make friends with those of high rank, and he spent much of his time with George Fairfax, who made his home at Belvoir near Mount Vernon. Lord Fairfax, a man of wealth and worth, was much at Belvoir at the time. He had bought large tracts of land in Virginia, which had not been staked out, or set off into lots. In fact, he did not know their size or shape, but he had heard that men had sought out some of the best spots, and had built homes there, and laid out farms for which they paid no rent, and he thought it quite time to put a stop to such things. In March 1748, George Washington, who had been picked out by Lord Fairfax for this task, went on his first trip with George Fairfax to stake off these wild lands. He wrote down what was done from day to day, and by these notes we learn that he had quite a rough time of it, and yet found much that was to his taste. He and the men with him rode for miles and miles through lands rich in grain, hemp, and tobacco, and through fine groves of trees on the bank of a broad stream. One night, writes George, when they had been hard at work all day, they came to the house where they were to be fed and lodged. The woodmen went to bed with their clothes on, but George took his off, and as he turned in he found his bed was of loose straw, with not a thing on it but the threadbare blanket he was to wrap himself in. The fleas and bugs soon forced George to get up and put on his clothes, and lie as the rest of the men did. And had we not been so tired, he says, I am sure we should not have slept much that night. He made a vow then that he would sleep out of doors near a fire when on such tramps, and run no more such risks.
On March 18th,
they reached a point on the Potomac which they were told they could not ford. There had been a great rainfall, and the stream had not been so high by 6 feet as it was at that time. They made up their minds to stay there for a day or two, went to see the warm springs, and at night camped out in the field. At the end of the 2 days, as the stream was still high, they swam their steeds to the Maryland side. The men crossed in birch bark boats, and rode all the next day in a rainstorm to a place 20 miles from where they had set out that morn. Washington writes that the road was the worst that had ever been trod by man or beast. On March 23rd they fell in with a score or two of red men, who had been off to war and brought home but one scalp, and they had a chance to see a war dance. The red men cleared a large space and built a fire in the midst of it, round which they all sat. One of the men then made a grand speech in which he told them how they were to dance. When he had done, the one who could dance the best sprang up as if he had just been roused from sleep, and ran and jumped round the ring in a queer kind of way. The rest soon joined him, and did just as he did. By this time the band made itself heard, and I shall have to tell you what a fine band it was. There was a pot half full of water with a piece of deerskin stretched tight on the top, and a gourd with some shot in it, and a piece of horse's tail tied to it to make it look fine. One man shook the gourd, and one drummed all the while the rest danced, and I doubt if you would care to hear the noise that was made. Late in the day of March 26th, they came to a place where dwelt a man named Hedge, who was in the pay of King George as justice of the peace. Here they camped, and at the meal that was spread there was not a knife nor a fork to eat with, but such as the guests had brought with them. On the night of the 1st of April, the wind blew and the rain fell. The straw on which they lay took fire, and George was saved by one of the men, who woke him when it was in a blaze. "I have not slept for 4 nights in a bed," wrote Washington at this time to one of his young friends at home. "But when I have walked a good deal in the day, I lie down on a heap of straw or bearskin by the fire, with man, wife, young ones, dogs, and cats, and he is in luck who gets the place next the fire." For 3 years he kept up this mode of life. But as it was a hard life to lead, he could be out but a few weeks at a time. His pay was a doubloon a day and some 6 pistoles. A doubloon is a gold coin of Spain, worth not quite $16. A pistole is a small gold coin of Spain, worth not quite $4. This rough kind of life, though he did not know it, was to fit him for the toils and ills of war, of which he may have dreamt in those days, as he still kept up his love for warlike things. While at work on the land round the Blue Ridge, he now and then made his way to Greenway Court, where Lord Fairfax dwelt at this time. Here he had a chance to read choice books, for Lord Fairfax had a fine mind, though his tastes were queer. He lived on a knoll, in a small house not more than 12 feet square. All around him were huts for his help. Black and white, red men, half-breeds, and woodmen thronged the place, where they were sure they would get a good meal. He had steeds of fine breed, and hounds of keen scent, for he was fond of the chase, and the woods and hills were full of game. Here was a grand chance for George, who had a great taste for field sports, and his rides and walks and talks with Lord Fairfax were a rich treat to the home-bred youth. This wise friend lent George good books, which he took with him to the woods and read with great care, and in this way stored his mind with rich thoughts. In Virginia there were some few men who had served in the late war twixt England and Spain, and they put George through such a drill with sword and with gun that he learned to use them both with great skill. A Dutchman named Van Brom was one of these men, and he claimed to know a great deal of the art of war. He it was that took George in hand to teach him the use of the sword and how to fence. When he was 19 years of age, the Redmen and the French had made such inroads on the front that it was thought best to place men on guard to keep back these foes, and uphold the laws of the state of Virginia. There was need of someone to take charge of the school of arms at one of the chief outposts where the French sought to get a foothold, and the choice fell on George Washington, who set to work at once to fit himself for the place. His brother's ill health caused this scheme to be dropped for a time, as Lawrence was forced to go to the West Indies for a change of air, and begged George to go with him. George gave up all thought of self, and the two set sail for Barbados, September 28, 1751. At sea he kept a log book, took notes of the course of the winds, and if the days were fair or foul, and learned all he could of the ways of a ship and how to sail one. They reached Barbados on November 3rd, and were pleased with the place, and all the strange sights that met their gaze. On all sides were fields of corn and sweet cane, and groves of trees rich in leaves and fruit, and all things held out hope for cure for the sick man whose lungs were in a weak state. They had been but 2 weeks in Barbados when George fell ill with smallpox, and this for a time put an end to all their sports. But he had the best of care, and at the end of 3 weeks was so well that he could go out of doors. Lawrence soon tired of this place, and longed for a change of scene. They had to ride out by the first dawn of day, for by the time the sun was half an hour high it was as hot as at midday. There was no change in the sick man's health, and he made up his mind to go to Bermuda in the spring. He was lonesome without his wife, so it was planned that George should go back home and bring her out to Bermuda. George set sail December 22nd, and reached Virginia at the end of 5 weeks. He must have been glad to step on shore once more, for the cold winds and fierce storms to be met with at sea at that time of year made life on shipboard something of a hardship. Lawrence did not gain in health, and ere his wife could join him he wrote her that he would start for home to his grave. He reached Mount Vernon in time to die 'neath his own roof, and with kind friends at his bedside. His death took place on the 26th of July, 1752, when he was but 34 years of age. He had been like a father to George, and their hearts were bound by ties so strong and sweet that it was a great grief for them to part. But George had no time to sit down and mourn his loss. There was work for him to do. New cares were thrust on him by his brother's death that took up all his time and thoughts for some months, and he had to keep up his drills with the men at the school of arms, for which he was paid by the state.
End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
Chapter 3. The First Step to Fame. The time had now come when Washington was to take a fresh start in life and win for himself high rank. The French, who thought they had just as good a right as the English to take up land in America, pressed their claims, and built forts on the Great Lakes and on the banks of the Ohio River. They made friends of the red men at or near these posts, and made it known that they would fight the English at all points. The red men on the north shore of Lake Ontario were good friends with the French, but those on the south shore were not. They had been well dealt with by the English, and their chief half-king did not like the warlike move that was made by the French. He went to the French post on Lake Erie, and spoke thus to the troops there: "You have no right to come here and build towns and take our land from us by fraud and force. We raised a flame in Montreal some time ago, where we asked you to stay and not to come here on our land. I now ask you to go back to that place, for this land is ours. Had you come in a peaceful way like the English, we should have let you trade with us as they do, but we will not let you come and build on our land and take it by force. You and the English are white. We live in a land between you, to which you and they have no right. The Great Being gave it to us. We have told the English to move off, and they have heard us, and now we tell it to you. We do not fear you, and we mean to keep you both at arm's length." The Frenchman said to Half King, "You talk like a fool. This land is mine, and I will have it.
Let who will stand up against me?
I have no fear of such as you. I tell you that down the Ohio I will go and build forts on it. If it were blocked up, I have troops enough to break through it, and to tread down all who would try to stop me. My force is as the sand of the sea." This proud speech made Half King feel as if he had been stabbed to the heart. It was the death blow to his race. But he turned with hope and trust to the English, who thus far had not shown a wish to do what was not just to his tribe. On October 30th, 1753, Washington set out from Williamsburg in Virginia with a small band of men. He was just of age, and ranked as Major Washington. He was to go to the French outpost near Lake Erie with a note from Governor Dinwiddie to the head man there to ask for a reply in the name of King George. He was to find out where forts had been built, and how large a force of troops had crossed the lakes, and to learn all that he could of those who had dared to set up the flag of France on soil
Which the English claimed as their own.
Washington's route lay through thick woods and swamps, where the foot of man had not trod. He had to climb steep and rough hills where wild beasts had their lairs, and to cross streams on frail rafts, if they could not swim or ford them. There were but 8 men in the whole band, and the post they were to reach lay 560 miles off, and the whole of the way had to be made on horseback or on foot. They met some of the Indian chiefs at a place called Logstown, and Washington made his first speech to the redmen. He told them what he had come for, and asked that some of their braves might go with him as guides and safeguards for the rest of the way. He then gave them what was called a speech belt, wrought with beads, as a sign that they were friends and full of peace and good will. The chiefs were mild and full of peace. They said that Washington might have some of their men as guides, but he would have to wait for 2 or 3 days, as the young braves had gone out in search of game. This Washington could not do. There was no time to lose, so he set out with but 4 red men as guides, and Half King was one of them. Through rain and snow, through a long stretch of dark woods that seemed to have no end, through deep streams and swamps where there was no sure foothold for man or beast, the brave band kept on their way. At the end of 35 days from the time they left Williamsburg, they reached a place called Venango, where they saw a house from the top of which a French flag flew, and Washington called a halt. The head man in charge asked him and his friends to sup with him. The wine was passed with a free hand, but Washington did not drink like his French host. He knew he would need to keep a cool head for his work. When the Frenchman had his tongue loosened by the wine, he told a good deal. "We have got the land," he said, "and we mean to keep it. You English may have 2 men to our 1, but you are slow. It takes you a long time to move." The man's tongue wagged on in a free way, and Washington, who kept his wits, wrote down all he said that could be of use to him. The next day it rained hard, and they could not go on. Then for the first time the Frenchmen found that there were red men with the English. Washington had kept them back, for he feared to trust them to the wiles of the French. But now the shrewd man made a great time, and hailed them as dear friends. He was so glad to see them. How could they be so near and not come to see him? He gave them gifts and plied them with strong drink, till Half King and his braves thought no more of what they had pledged to the English. They were soon in such a state that they did not care to move. It took some time for Washington to get them free from the wiles of the French, and it took 4 days more of snow and rain through mire and swamp to reach the fort for which they had set out. Here Washington met the chief of the fort, and made known the cause that had brought him. He gave him the note from Governor Dinwiddie, in which it was asked why the French had come into a state that was owned by Great Britain, and they were bid to go in peace. The French took 2 days in which to think of the course they should take, and in this time Washington set down in his note book the size and strength of the fort, and all that he could find out. He told his men to use their eyes, and to count the boats in the stream and the guns in the fort. The first chance he had, Washington drew a plan of this fort, and it was sent to England for King George to see. Washington saw that the Half King and the braves with him had much to say to the French, and he did not trust them. He heard that the English who sought to trade on the Ohio were seized by the French, and that some red men had passed the fort with 2 or 3 white scalps. All this made him wish to get off safe with his small band, and when the French chief gave him a sealed note, he had a shrewd guess as to what was in it. At last, when the start was to be made, the French chief had large stores of food and wine put on their boats, and made a great show of good will, but at the same time he tried to keep the red men with him, and told them he would give them guns for gifts the next day. Washington was pressed by the red men to wait that long for them, and the next morning the French had to give the guns. Then they tried to get the red men to drink once more, but Washington pled with them, and at last got them to start. It was hard to steer the boats, as the stream was full of ice, and at times they had to leap out and stand in the wet for an hour at a time, to drag the boats by main force off the shoals. On the part of the trip that had to be made by land, they had a hard time, too. It was cold, the roads were deep in mire, and the steeds were so worn out that it was feared they would fall by the way. Washington gave up his horse to help bear the food and things for use, and he asked his friends to do so too. They all went on foot, and the cold grew worse. There was deep snow that froze as it fell. For 3 days they toiled in a slow way. At last Washington made up his mind to leave the men and steeds in charge of one of his band, and to strike off with his pack on his back and his gun in his hand by a way which, it seemed to him, would take him home by a short cut. He had the sealed note that he wished to give up as soon as he could. He took but 1 man with him. At night they lit a fire, and camped by it in the woods. At 2 in the morn they were once more on foot. They fell in with a red man who claimed to know Mr. Gist, the man who was with Washington, and called him by his name in his own tongue, and seemed glad to see him. They asked the red man if he would go with them and show them a short cut to the forks of the Allegheny River. The red man seemed glad to serve them, and took Washington's pack on his own back. Then the 3 set out, and walked at a brisk pace for 8 or 10 miles. By this time Washington's feet were so sore that he could not take a step without pain, and he was well tired out. He thought it best to camp where they were, and the red men begged Washington to let him bear his gun. But the Major would not let it go out of his own hands. This made the red men cross, and he urged them to keep on, and said there were redskins in the woods who would scalp them if they lay out all night. He would take them to his own hut where they would be safe. The red men lost faith in their guide, and were soon quite ill at ease. when the red men found that he could not make them go his way or do as he said, he ceased to wear the face of a friend. At heart he was the foe of all white men. All at once he made a stop, and then turned and fired on them. Washington found that he was not hit, so he turned to Mr. Gist and said, "Are you shot?" "No," said Gist. Then the red man ran to a big white oak to load his gun. Gist would have killed him, but Washington would not let him. Gist says, "We let him charge his gun. We found he put in a ball. Then we took care of him. The Major or I stood by the guns. We made him make a fire for us by a small run, as if we were meant to sleep there. I said to the Major, 'As you will not have him killed, we must get rid of him in some way, and then we must march on all night.' On which I said to the red men, 'I suppose you were lost and fired your gun.' He said he knew the way to his log hut, and it was not far off. 'Well,' said I, 'do you go home, and as we are tired we will follow your track in the morning, and here is a cake of bread for you, and you must give us meat in the morning.' He was glad to get off." Washington says, "We walked all the rest of the night, and made no stop that we might get to the start so far as to be out of their reach the next day, since we were quite sure they would get on our track as soon as it was light. But no more was seen or heard of them, and the next night at dusk the two white men came to the Allegheny, which they thought to cross on the ice. This they could not do, so they had to go to work with but one small axe, and a poor one at that, and make a raft. It was a whole day's work. They next got it launched, and went on board of it, then set off. But when they were in mid stream the raft was jammed in the ice in such a way that death seemed to stare them in the face. Washington put out his pole to stay the raft so that the ice might pass by, but the tide was so swift that it drove the ice with great force. It bore down on the pole so hard that Washington was thrown into the stream, where it was at least 10 feet deep. He would have been swept out of sight if he had not caught hold of one of the raft logs. As they found they could not cross the stream or get back to the shore they had left, they quit the raft and got on a small
Isle near which they were borne by the tide.
But this was not the end of their ill luck. It was so cold that Mr. Gist's hands and feet froze, and both he and Washington were in great pain throughout the long dark night. A gleam of hope came with the dawn of day, for they found the ice twixt them and the east bank of the stream was so hard as to bear their weight, and they made their way on it, and the same day came to a place where they could rest. Here they spent 2 or 3 days. They set out on the 1st of January, and the next day came to the Monongahela, where Washington bought a horse. On the 11th he got to Belvoir, where he stopped one day to take the rest he was in need of, and then set out and reached Williamsburg on the 16th of January. He gave to Governor Dinwiddie the note that he had brought from the French chief, showed him the plans of the fort, and told him all that he had seen and done. The fame of his deeds, of the ills he had borne,
And the nerve and
pluck he had shown, was soon noised abroad, and George Washington, though a mere youth, was looked up to by young and old.
End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
Chapter 4. To the Front. The French chief in his note to Governor Dinwiddie had said, in words that were smooth but clear, that he would not leave the banks of the Ohio, so the English felt as if it were time for them to make a move, though they did not wish to bring on a war. Land was set off on the Ohio, where a fort was built, and the rest of it left for the use of the troops. Washington was asked to lead the troops, but he shrank from it as a charge too great for one so young. So Joshua Fry was made colonel, and Washington lieutenant colonel of a force of 300 men. It was hard to get men to join the ranks. The pay was small, and those who had good farms and good homes did not care to leave them. Those who had a mind to go were for the most part men who did not like to work, and had no house or home that they could call their own. Some were barefoot, Some had no shirts to their backs, and not a few were without coat or waistcoat, as the vest was called in those days. If it was hard work to get these kind of men, it was still more of a task to find those who would serve as chiefs, and Washington found himself left in charge of a lot of raw troops who knew no will but their own. But Van Braam, who had taught Washington how to use the sword, was with him, and gave him just the aid he had need of at this time. On April 2, 1754, Washington, at the head of 150 men, set off for the new fort at the fork of the Ohio. The roads were rough, and the march was slow, and it was not till April 20th that they reached Will's Creek. Here they were met by a small force, in charge of Captain Adam Stephen. The rest of the force, with the field guns, were to come by way of the Potomac. These last were in charge of Colonel Fry. When Washington reached Will's Creek, word was brought him that a large force of French troops had borne down on the new fort. Captain Trent, who was in charge of the few troops in the fort, was away at the time, and the young Ensign Ward did not know what to do. He sought the aid of Half King, who told him to plead with the French, and to beg them to wait till the captain came back, and the two went at once to the French camp. But the French would not wait or make terms of peace. They had come as foes, and told Ensign Ward that if he did not leave the fort at once, with all his men, they would put him out by force. All the French would grant was that our men might take their tools with them. So the next morn they filed out of the fort, gave up their arms, and took the path to the woods. The French took the fort and built it up, and called it Fort Duquesne, which was the name of the governor of Canada. When the sad news was brought to Washington, he was at a loss to know what to do, or which way to turn. Here he was with a small band of raw troops right in the midst of foes, red and white, who would soon hem them in and use them ill if they found out where they were. Yet it would not do to turn back or show signs of fear. Colonel Fry had not yet come up, and the weight of care was thrown on Washington. He let the governors of Pennsylvania and Maryland know of his plight, and urged them to send on troops, but none came to his aid. He had a talk with his chief men, and they all thought it would be best to push on through the wild lands and make the road as they went on, and try to reach the mouth of Redstone Creek, where they would build a fort. By this means the men would be kept at work, their fears would be quelled, and a way made for the smooth and swift march of the troops in the rear. There was so much to be done that the men, work as hard as they might, could not clear the way with much speed. There were great trees to be cut down, rocks to be moved, swamps to be filled up, and streams to be bridged. While in the midst of these toils the bread gave out, and the lack of food made the men too weak to work. In spite of all these ills, they made out to move at a rate of 4 miles a day up steep hills and through dense woods that have since borne the name of the Shades of Death. While at a large stream where they had to stop to build a bridge, Washington was told that it was not worth while for him to try to go by land to Redstone Creek, when he could go by boat in much less time. This would be a good plan if it would work, and to make sure Washington took 5 men with him in a bark boat down the stream. One of these men was a redskin guide. When they had gone 10 miles, the guide said that that was as far as he would go. Washington said, "Why do you want to leave us now? We need you, and you know that we cannot get on without you. Tell us why you wish to leave." The red men said, "Me want gifts. The red men will not work without them. The French know this and are wise. If you want the red men to be your guides, you must buy them. They do not love you so well that they will serve you without pay." Washington told the guide that when they got back he would give them a fine white shirt with a frill on it, and a good greatcoat, and this put an end to the strike for that time. They kept on in a small boat for a score of miles, till they came to a place where there was a falls in the stream at least 40 feet. This put a stop to their course, and Washington went back to camp with his mind made up to go on by land. He was on his way to join his troops when word was brought him from Half King to be on his guard, as the French were close at hand. They had been on the march for 2 days, and meant to strike the first foe they should see. Half King said that he and the rest of his chiefs would be with Washington in 5 days to have a talk. Washington set to work at once to get his troops in shape to meet the foe. Scouts were sent out. There was a scare in the night. The troops sprang to arms and kept on the march till daybreak. In the meantime, at 9 o'clock at night, word came from Half King, who was then 6 miles from the camp, that he had seen the tracks of 2 Frenchmen, and the whole force was near that place. Washington put himself at the head of 20 men, left the rest to guard the camp, and set off to join Half King. The men had to grope their way by footpaths through the woods. The night was dark, and there had been quite a fall of rain, so that they slipped and fell and lost their way, and had to climb the great rocks and the trees that had been blown down and blocked their way. It was near sunrise when they came up to the camp of Half King, who at once set out with a few of his braves to show Washington the tracks he had seen. Then Half King called up 2 of his braves, showed them the tracks, and told them what to do. They took the scent and went off like hounds, and brought back word that they had traced the footprints to a place shut in by rocks and trees where the French were in camp. It was planned to take them off their guard. Washington was to move on the right, Half King and his men on the left. They made not a sound. Washington was the first on the ground, and as he came out from the rocks and trees at the head of his men, the French caught sight of him and ran to their arms. A sharp fire was kept up on both sides. De Jumonville, who led the French troops, was killed with 10 of his men. 1 of Washington's men was killed, and 2 or 3 met with wounds. None of the red men were hurt, as the French did not aim their guns at them at all. In less than half an hour the French gave way and ran, but Washington's men soon came up with them, took them, and they were sent in charge of a strong guard to Governor Dinwiddie. This was the first act of war in which blood had been shed, and Washington had to bear a great deal of blame from both French and England till the truth was made known. He was thought to have been too rash and too bold, and in more haste to make war than to seek for peace. These sins were charged to his youth, for it was not known then how much more calm and wise and shrewd he was than most men who were twice his age. The French claimed that this band had been sent out to ask Washington in a kind way to leave the lands that were held by the crown of France, but Washington was sure they were spies. And Half King said they had bad hearts, and if our men were such fools as to let them go, he would give them no more aid. Half King was full of fight, and Washington was flushed with pride, and in haste to move on and brave the worst. He wrote home, "The Mingoes have struck the French, and I hope will give a good blow before they have done." Then he told of the fight he had been in, and how he had won it, and was not hurt though he stood in the midst of the fierce fire. The balls whizzed by him, and, said Washington, I was charmed with the sound. This boast came to the ears of George II, who said, in a dry sort of way, he would not say so if he had heard many. When long years had passed, someone asked Washington if he had made such a speech. "If I did," he said, "it was when I was young," and he was but 22 years of age. He knew that as soon as the French heard of the fight and their bad luck, they would send a strong force out to meet him. So he set all his men to work to add to the size of the earthwork, and to fence it in so that it might be more of a stronghold. Then he gave to it the name of Fort Necessity, for it had been thrown up in great haste in time of great need, when food was so scant it was feared the troops would starve to death. At one time, for 6 days, they had no flour and of course no bread. News came of the death of Colonel Fry at Will's Creek, and Washington was forced to take charge of the whole force. Fry's troop, 300 in all, came up from Will's Creek, and Half King brought 40 red men with their wives and young ones, and all these had to be fed and cared for. Young as he was, Washington was like a father to this strange group of men. On Sundays, when in camp, he read to them from the Word of God, and by all his acts made them feel that he was a good and true man and fit to be their chief. The red men did quite well as spies and scouts, but were not of much use in the field, and they and some men from South Carolina did much to vex young Washington. Half King did not like the way that white men fought, so he took himself and his band off to a safe place. The white men from South Carolina, who had come out to serve their king, were too proud to soil their hands or do hard work, nor would they be led by a man of the rank of colonel. In the midst of all these straits, Washington stood calm and firm. The South Carolina troops were left to guard the fort, while the rest of the men set out to clear the road to Redstone Creek. Their march was slow and full of toil, and at the end of 2 weeks they had gone but 13 miles. Here at Gist's home, where they stopped to rest, word came to Washington that a large force of the French were to be sent out to fight him. Word was sent to the fort to have the men that were there to join them with all speed. They reached Gist's at dusk, and by dawn of the next day all our troops were in that place, where it was at first thought they would wait for the foe. But this plan they gave up, for it was deemed best to make haste back to the fort, where they might at least screen themselves from the fire of the foe. The roads were rough, the heat was great, the food was scant, and the men weak and worn out. There were but few steeds, and these had to bear such great loads that they could not move with speed. Washington gave up his own horse and went on foot, and the rest of the headmen did the same. The troops from Virginia worked with a will and would take turns and haul the big field guns, while the King's troops from South Carolina walked at their ease and would not lend a hand or do a stroke of work. On the morn of July 3rd, scouts brought word to the fort that the French were but 4 miles off and in great force. Washington at once drew up his men on the ground outside of the fort to wait for the foe. Ere noon the French were quite near the fort, and the sound of their guns was heard. Washington thought this was a trick to draw his men out into the woods, so he told them to hold their fire till the foe came in sight. But as the French did not show themselves, though they still kept up their fire, he drew his troops back to the fort and bade them fire at will and do their best to hit their mark. The rain fell all day long, so that the men in the fort were half drowned, and some of the guns scarce fit for use. The fire was kept up till 8 o'clock at night, when the French sent word they would like to make terms with our men. Washington thought it was a trick to find out the state of things in the fort, and for a time gave no heed to the call. The French sent 2 or 3 times, and at last brought the terms for Washington to read. They were in French. There was nothing at hand to write with, so Van Braam, who could speak French, was called on to give the key. It was a queer scene. A light was brought and held close to his face so that he could see to read. The rain fell in such sheets that it was hard to work to keep up the flame. Van Braam mixed up Dutch, French, and English in a sad way, while Washington and his chief aides stood near with heads bent and tried their best to guess what was meant. They made out at last that the main terms were that the troops might march out of the fort and fear no harm from French or redskins as they made their way back to their homes. The drums might beat and the flags fly, and they could take with them all the goods and stores and all that was in the fort but the large guns. These the French would break up, and our men should pledge themselves not to build on the lands which were claimed by the King of France for the space of 1 year. The weak had to yield to the strong, and Washington and his men laid down their arms and marched out of the fort. A note of thanks was sent to Washington and all his head men but Van Braam, who was thought to have read the terms in such a way as to harm our side and serve the French. But there were those who felt that Van Braam was as true as he was brave, and that it was the fault of his head and not his heart, for it was a hard task for a Dutchman to turn French into English and make sense of it.
End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 5. As Aide-De-Camp. In spite of the way in which the fight at Great Meadows came to an end, Governor Dinwiddie made up his mind that the troops, led by Washington, should cross the hills and drive the French from Fort Duquesne. Washington thought it a wild scheme, for the snow lay deep on the hills. His men were worn out and had no arms, nor tents, nor clothes, nor food, such as would fit them to take the field. It would need gold to buy these things, as well as to pay for fresh troops. Gold was placed in the governor's hands to use as he pleased. Our force was spread out into 10 bands of 100 men each. The King's troops were put in high rank, and Colonel Washington was made captain. This, of course, was more than he could bear, so he left the army at once and with a sad heart. In a short time Governor Sharp of Maryland was placed by King George at the head of all the force that was to fight the French. He knew that he would need the aid of Washington, and he begged him to come back and serve with him in the field. But Washington did not like the terms and paid no heed to the call. The next spring General Braddock came from England with two large bands of well-trained troops, which it was thought would drive the French back into Canada. Our men were full of joy, and thought the war would soon be at an end. Braddock urged Washington to join him in the field. Washington felt that he could be of great use, as he knew the land and the ways of red men. So he took up the sword once more as Braddock's aide-de-camp. Benjamin Franklin, who had charge of the mails, lent his aid to the cause, and did all that he could to serve Braddock and his men. Braddock, with his staff and guard of horsemen, set out for Will's Creek by the way of Winchester in April 1755. He rode in a fine turnout that he had bought of Governor Sharp, which he soon found out was not meant for use on rough roads. But he had fought with dukes and men of high rank, and was fond of show, and liked to put on a great deal of style. He thought that this would make the troops look up to him, and would add much to his fame. In May the troops went into camp, and Washington had a chance to learn much of the art of war that was new and strange to him, and to see some things that made him smile. All the rules and forms of camp life were kept up. One of the headmen who died while in camp was borne to the grave in this style. A guard marched in front of the corpse, the captain of it in the rear. Each man held his gun upside down as a sign that the dead would war no more, and the drums beat the dead march. When near the grave, the guard formed two lines that stood face to face, let their guns rest on the ground, and leaned their heads on the butts. The corpse was borne twixt these two rows of men with the sword and sash on the top of the box in which he lay, and in the rear of it the men of rank marched two and two. When the corpse was put in the ground, the guard fired their guns 3 times, and then all the troops marched back to camp. The red men, the Delawares and the Shawnees, came to aid General Braddock. With them were White Thunder, who had charge of the speech belts, and Silver Heels, who was swift of foot. Half King was dead, and White Thunder reigned in his stead. The red men had a camp to themselves, where they would sing and dance and howl and yell for half the night. It was fun for the King's troops to watch them at their sports and games, and they soon found a great charm in the wild sort of life. In the daytime the red men and their squaws, rigged up in their plumes and war paint, hung round Braddock's camp and gazed spellbound at the troops as they went through their drills. But this state of things did not last long, and strife rose twixt the red and white men, and some of the redskins left the camp. They told Braddock they would meet him on his march, but they did not keep their word. Washington was sent to Williamsburg to bring the gold of which there was need, and when he came back he found Washington. The march was a hard one for man and beast. Up steep hills and through rough roads they had to drag the guns, and Braddock soon found out that these new fields were not like the ones on which he had been wont to fight. Hard as it was for his pride to seek the aid of so young a man, he was at last forced to ask Washington to help him out of these straits. They had then made a halt at Little Meadows. Washington said there was no time to lose. They must push on at once. While at this place Captain Jack and his brave band of huntsmen came into camp. They were fond of the chase, and were well armed with knives and guns, and looked quite like a tribe of redskins as they came out of the wood. Braddock met them in a stiff sort of way. Captain Jack stepped in front of his band and said that he and his men were used to rough work, and knew how to deal with the red men, and would be glad to join the force. Braddock looked on him with a gaze of scorn, and spoke to him in a way that roused the ire of Captain Jack. He told his men what had been said, and the whole band turned their backs on the camp, and went through the woods to their old haunts, where they were known and prized at their true worth. In the meantime Washington, who had had a headache for some days, grew so ill that he could not ride on his horse, and had to be borne part of the time in a cart. Braddock, who knew well what a loss his death would be, said that he should not go on. Washington pleaded with him, but Braddock was firm, and made him halt on the road. Here he was left with a guard, and in the care of Dr. Craik, and here he had to stay for 2 long weeks. By that time he could move, but not without much pain, for he was still quite weak. It was his wish to join the troops in time for the great blow, and while yet too weak to mount his horse, he set off with his guards in a close cart, and reached Braddock's camp on the 8th of July. He was just in time, for the troops were to move on Fort Duquesne the next day. The fort was on the same side of the Monongahela as the camp, but twixt them lay a pass 2 miles in length, with the stream on the left and a high range of hills on the right. The plan was to ford the stream near the camp, march on the west bank of the stream for 5 miles or so, then cross to the east side and push on to the fort. By sunrise the next day, the troops turned out in fine style and marched off to the noise of the drum and fife. To Washington this was a great sight. Though still weak and ill, he rode his horse, and took his place on the staff as aide-de-camp. At 1 o'clock the whole force had crossed the ford north of the fort, and were on their way up the bank, when they were met by a fierce and sharp fire from foes they could not see. Wild war whoops and fierce yells rent the air. What Washington feared had come to pass. Braddock did his best to keep the troops in line, but as fast as they moved up, they were cut down by foes screened by rocks and trees. Now and then one of the red men would dart out of the woods with a wild yell to scalp a redcoat who had been shot down. Wild fear seized Braddock's men, who fired and took no aim. Those in the front rank were killed by those in the rear. Some of the Virginia troops took post back of trees and fought as the red men did. Washington thought it would be a good plan for Braddock's men to do the same, but he thought there was but one way for troops to fight, and that brave men ought not to skulk in that way. When some of them took to the trees, Braddock stormed at them and called them hard names, and struck them with the flat of his sword. All day long Washington rode here and there in the midst of the fight. He was in all parts of the field, a fine mark for the guns of the foe, and yet not a shot struck him to do him harm. 4 small shots went through his coat. 2 of his steeds were shot down, and though those who stood near him fell dead at his side, Washington had not one wound. The fight raged on. Death swept through the ranks of the redcoats. The men at the guns were seized with fright. Washington sprang from his horse, wheeled a brass field piece with his own hand, and sent a good shot through the woods. But this act did not bring the men back to their guns. Braddock was on the field the whole day, and did his best to turn the tide. But most of his headmen had been slain in his sight. 5 times he had been forced to mount a fresh horse, as one by one was struck down by the foeman's shot, and still he kept his ground and tried to check the flight of his men. At last a shot struck him in the right arm and went into his lungs. He fell from his horse and was borne from the field. The troops took fright at once, and most of them fled. The yells of the red men still rang in their ears. "All is lost!" they cried. "Braddock is killed!" Washington had been sent to a camp 40 miles off, and was on his way back when he heard the sad news. But Braddock did not die at once. He was brought back to camp, and for 2 days lay in a calm state, but full of pain. Now and then his lips would move, and he was heard to say, "Who would have thought it? We shall know how to deal with them the next time." He died at Fort Necessity on the night of July 13th. Had he done as Washington told him, he might have saved his own life and won the day. But he was a proud man, and when he made up his mind to do a thing he would do it at all risks. Through this fault he missed the fame he hoped to win, lost his life, and found a grave in a strange land. His loss was a great gain to Washington, for all felt that he, so calm, so grave, so free from fear, was the right sort of man to lead troops to war. Those who had seen him in the field thought that he bore a charmed life, for though he stood where the shot fell thick and fast, he was not hurt and showed no signs of fear. But Washington was weak and in need of rest, and as the death of Braddock left him with no place in the force, he went back to Mount Vernon, where he thought to spend the rest of his days. The fight which he took part in as aide-de-camp, and which had so sad an end, goes by the name of Braddock's defeat. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 6. Colonel of Virginia Troops. The troops in Virginia were left without a head. There was no one to lead them out to war, and if this fact came to the ears of the French, they would be more bold. Washington's friends urged him to ask for the place, but this would not do. His brother wrote him thus: "Our hopes rest on you, dear George. You are the man for the place. All are loud in your praise." But Washington was firm. He wrote back and told in plain words all that he had borne, and how he had been served for the past 2 years. "I love my land," he said, "and shall be glad to serve it, but not on the same terms that I have done so." His mother begged him not to risk his life in these wars. He wrote her that he should do all that he could to keep out of harm's way, but if he should have a call to drive the foes from the land of his birth, he would have to go. And this he was sure would give her much more pride than if he were to stay at home. On the same day, August 13th, that this note was sent, word came to Washington that he had been made chief of all troops in Virginia, and the next month he went to Winchester to stay. Here he found much to do. There was need of more troops, and it was hard work to get them. Forts had to be built, and he drew up a plan of his own and set his men to work it out, and went out from time to see how they got on with it. He rode off thus at the risk of his life, for red men lay in wait for scalps and were fierce to do deeds of blood. The stir of war put new life into the veins of old Lord Fairfax. He got up a troop of horse and put them through a drill on the lawn at Greenway Court. He was fond of the chase, and knew how to run the sly fox to the ground. The red man was a sort of fox, and Fairfax was keen for the chase, and now and then would mount his steed and call on George Washington, who was glad to have his kind friend so near. In a short time he had need of his aid, for word came from the fort at Will's Creek that a band of red men were on the war path with firebrands and knives, and were then on their way to Winchester. A man on a fleet horse was sent post haste to Washington, who had been called to Williamsburg, the chief town. In the meantime Lord Fairfax sent word to all the troops near his home to arm and haste to the aid of Winchester. Those on farms flocked to the towns, where they thought they would be safe, and the townfolk fled to the west side of the Blue Ridge. In the height of this stir Washington rode into town, and the sight of him did much to quell their fears. He thought that there were but a few redskins who had caused this great scare, and it was his wish to take the field at once and go out and put them to flight. But he could get but a few men to go with him. The rest of the town's troops would not stir. All the old firearms that were in the place were brought out, and smiths set to work to scour off the rust and make them fit for use. Caps, such as are now used on guns, were not known in those days. Flintstones took their place. One of these was put into the lock, so that when it struck a piece of steel it would flash fire, and the spark would set off the gun. These were called flintlock guns. Such a thing as a match had not been thought of, and flintstones were made use of to light all fires. Carts were sent off for balls and flints, and for food with which to feed all those who had flocked to Winchester. The tribes of red men that had once served with Washington were now on good terms with the French. One of their chiefs, named Jacob, laughed at forts that were built of wood, and made his boast that no fort was safe from him if it would catch fire. The town where these red men dwelt was 20 miles from Fort Duquesne, and a band of brave white men, with George Armstrong and Hugh Mercer at their head, set out from Winchester to put them to rout. At the end of a long march they came at night on the red men's stronghold, and took them off their guard. The red men, led by the fierce chief Jacob, who chose to die ere he would yield, made a strong fight, but in the end most of them were killed. Their huts were set on fire, and the brave stronghold was a stronghold no more. In the meantime, Washington had left Winchester and gone to Fort Cumberland on Will's Creek. Here he kept his men at work on the new roads and old ones. Some were sent out as scouts. Brigadier General Forbes, who was in charge of the whole force, was on his way from Philadelphia, but his march was a slow one, as he was not in good health. The plan was when he came to move on the French fort. The work that was to have been done north of the fort by Lord Loudoun hung fire. It was felt that he was not the right man for the place, and so his lordship was sent back to England. Major General Abercrombie then took charge of the King's troops at the north. These were to charge on Crown Point. Major General Amherst, with a large force of men, was with the fleet of Admiral Boscawen that set sail from Halifax the last of May. These were to lay siege to Louisburg and the Isle of Cape Breton, which is at the mouth of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Forbes was to move on Fort Duquesne, and was much too slow to suit Washington, who was in haste to start. His men had worn out their old clothes and were in great need of new ones, which they could not get for some time. He liked the dress the Redmen wore. It was light and cool, and what had to be thought of most, it was cheap. Washington had some of his men put on this dress, and it took well, and has since been worn by those who roam the woods and plains of our great land. I will not tell you of all that took place near the Great Lakes at this time, as I wish to keep your mind on George Washington. The schemes laid out by General Forbes did not please Washington, who urged a prompt march on the fort while the roads were good. He wrote to Major Halkett, who had been with Braddock and was now on Forbes's staff. I find him fixed to lead a new way to the Ohio, through a road each inch of which must be cut where we have scarce time left to tread the old track, which is known by all to be the best path through the hills. He made it plain that if they went that new way all would be lost, and they would be waylaid by the redskins and meet with all sorts of ills. But no heed was paid to his words, and the warm days came to an end. 6 weeks were spent in hard work on the new road, with a gain of less than 80 miles, when the whole force might have been in front of the French fort had they marched by the old road as Washington had urged. At a place known as Loyal Hannon, the troops were brought to a halt, as Forbes thought this was a good place to build a fort. Some men in charge of Major Grant went forth as scouts. At dusk they drew near a fort, and set fire to a log house near its walls. This was a rash thing to do, as it let the French know just where they were. But not a gun was fired from the fort. This the King's troops took for a sign of fear, and were bold and proud and quite sure that they would win the day. So Braddock had thought, and we know his fate. At length, when Forbes and his men were off their guard, the French made a dash from the fort, and poured their fire on the King's troops. On their right and left flanks fell a storm of shot from the redskins, who had hid back of trees, rocks, and shrubs. The King's troops were then brought up in line, and for a while stood firm and fought for their lives. But they were no match for the redskins, whose fierce yells made the blood run chill. Major Lewis fought hand to hand with a brave, whom he laid dead at his feet. Redskins came up at once to take the white man's scalp, and there was but one way in which he could save his life. This was to give himself up to the French, which both he and Major Grant were forced to do, as their troops had been put to rout with a great loss. Washington won much praise for the way in which the Virginia troops had fought, and he was once put in charge of a large force, who were to lead the van, serve as scouts, and do their best to drive back the redskins, work that called for the best skill and nerve. It was late in the fall of the year when the King's troops all met Loyal Hannon, and so much had to be done to clear the roads, that snow would be on the ground ere they could reach the fort. But from those of the French they had seized in the late fight, they found out that there were but a few troops in the fort, that food was scarce, and the redskins false to their trust. This lent hope to the King's troops, who made up their minds to push on. They took up their march at once, with no tents or stores, and but few large guns. Washington rode at the head. It was a sad march, for the ground was strewn with the bones of those who had fought with Grant and with Braddock, and had been slain by the foe, or died of their wounds. At length the troops drew near the fort, and made their way up to it with great care, for they thought the French would be in wait for them. and that there would be a fierce fight. But the French had had such bad luck in Canada that they had lost heart, and those in the fort were left to take care of themselves. So when the English were one day's march from the fort, the French stole out at night, got into boats, set the fort on fire, and went down the Ohio by the light of the flames. So the fort, which had been the cause of so much bloodshed, fell at last without a blow, and on November 25th, 1758, Washington, with his vanguard, marched in and placed the British flag on the wreck of the once proud stronghold, the name of which was changed to Fort Pitt. The French gave up all claim to the Ohio from that time. The redskins were quick to make friends with those who held sway, and there was peace with all but the tribes twixt the Ohio and the lakes. Washington had made up his mind to leave the field when this war came to an end, and in December of that same year he bade his troops good-bye. He had been with them for 5 years in a hard school, and the strain on his mind had been so great that he lost his health and felt that he could war no more.
End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
Chapter 7. The Home of Washington. In the year 1758, while Washington was were her charms that men of wealth and rank sought for her hand, but Washington, so calm and grave, and with his way yet to make in the world, won her heart, and they were to be wed at the close of the war. She had heard of the brave deeds he had done, and was proud to be the wife of such a man. So on January 6, 1759, the two were made one. In the course of a few months, Washington went to live at Mount Vernon, where he spent much of his time in the care of his own lands and those of his wife. He had a seat with those who made laws for the state, and no man was thought more of than George Washington. Washington loved to be at Mount Vernon, where he had spent a great part of his boyhood, with his brother Lawrence, of whom he was so fond. The house stood on a knoll, and near it were wild woods and deep dells, haunts of the fox and the deer, and bright streams where fish could be found at all times. His chief sport was the chase, and at the right time of the year he would go out 2 or 3 times a week with dogs and horns and trained steeds in search of the sly fox who would lead him and his friends a fine run. Sometimes he would go out with his gun and shoot wild ducks, great flocks of which might be found on the streams close at hand, or he would scour the woods for the game with which they were filled, and which none of those who owned the place had a right to kill. A man who had a bad name and paid no heed to the laws that were made was wont to make his way to the grounds near Mount Vernon and shoot just what game he chose. More than once he had to be told to leave and not come back, but he paid no more heed than if he had been deaf, and was sure to take his pick from the best kind of ducks. One day when Washington was out on horseback, he heard the sound of a gun down near the edge of the stream. He put spurs to his horse, dashed through brush and brake, and soon came up to the rogue, who had just time to jump in his boat and push from shore. Then the bad man raised his gun, cocked it, and took aim at Washington, whom he would no doubt have shot down in cold blood. But Washington rode at once into the stream and seized the prow of the boat and drew it to shore. Then he sprang from his horse, wrenched the gun from the thief's hand, and laid on the lash in such a way that the rogue took to his heels when let loose, and came no more to Mount Vernon. As I told you, men of great wealth dwelt on the shores of the Potomac, and kept house in fine style. They had a large force of slaves, and made great feasts for their friends. One of them used to come out in a rich barge to meet Washington. This barge was rowed by 6 black men in check shirts and black velvet caps. Washington had a coach and 4, with black footmen, for Mrs. Washington to use when she drove out.
but he chose to go on horseback. Sometimes he and his wife went to Annapolis to a ball or feast of some sort, where Washington took part in the dance, and all the belles of the day were proud to dance with him, for he had a grand style that made him seem like no one else in the room. When storms kept him in the house, he would read or spend time at his desk with pen in hand. He was kind to his slaves, and took the best care of them when they were sick, but was quick to see that they did not shirk their work. He knew, too, just the kind of work each one was fit for, and which he could do the best. 4 of his slaves set out to hew and shape a large log. Washington kept his eye on them and thought they loafed too much. So he sat down, took out his watch, and timed them, how long it took them to get their cross-cut saw and the rest of their tools, how long to cut off the limbs of the tree they had laid low, how long to hew and saw it, what time they spent in talk, and how much work they did while he sat there and took notes. In this way he found out just how much work 4 men could do in the course of a day, and take their ease. Washington was quick to lend a hand in time of need, and once when word was brought him that the dam had broke loose and the mill would soon be swept off, he ran at the head of all his slaves and workmen, and toiled as hard as they in a fierce rain storm to check the force of the flood. The cares of home and state made such calls on his time and thoughts, that he could not be said to live quite at his ease, and he left his mark, a high one, on all that he did. His crops were of the best, and he sought to cheat no one. The flour he sold from year to year was put up with so much care, and was of such good kind, and so true in weight, that all that bore the name George Washington Mount Vernon was held at a high rate in the West India ports. Quite a trade was kept up with Europe, where all the goods had to be bought that were used in the house or on the farm. Twice a year Washington sent a long list of such things as he had need of: plows, hoes, scythes, horse goods, and clothes for all the household. For these last he had to give size and height, name and age of those who were to wear them. In one of these lists Washington, who had need of a new suit of clothes, said he was 6 feet in height, quite thin, and had long limbs. He was then 31 years old. You will see by what I have told you just how Washington spent much of his time for at least 5 years. They were 5 sweet years to him, full of peace and rest and joy. He was fond of his home, and felt as much pride in Nellie and John Parke Custis as if they had been his own boy and girl. Nellie was a frail child, and did not gain in strength, though she had the best of care. Her death took place on June 19, 1773, when she was but 17 years of age. This was a sad blow to Washington as well as to his wife. And then all their hopes were placed on the son, who bade fair to be a fine, strong man. But he died in the year 1781 at the age of 28. While Washington dwelt in peace at Mount Vernon, war was rife in the land. But as he had withdrawn from those who bore arms, he took no part in it. It was called Pontiac's War, as it was led by a chief of that name. But the Ohio tribes were with him, and the plot was deep laid. Large tracts of woodland were laid waste, homes were burnt, and those who dwelt in them robbed and slain. And so sly and shrewd were the redskins that it was some time ere the white men could put a stop to their deeds of blood. It was in 1760 that King George III made up his mind to tax the folks in America for all the goods they bought in England. The trade was large, and in this way the king could add much to his wealth. But the scheme did not work well. It was first tried in Boston, and set all the folks there by the ears. They claimed that they had the rights as well as the king. They had come to this land to be free, and free they would be. They would do without tea and such things, and dress as well as they could in clothes made out of home-made goods. The king next said that goods bought from England must bear the king's stamp, for which a sum was to be paid more than the cost of the goods. This was known as the Stamp Act. The folks in America were poor. They had not the means to pay this tax. The thought of it filled them with rage, and for 5 years there was much talk of the wrong the king had done to those who dwelt in America. On the first day of November, 1765, the Stamp Act was to go into force, and all New England was in arms, At Boston bells were tolled, flags were hung at half-mast, shops were shut, and bonfires built. In New York, the act, in clear print, was borne through the streets on a pole, on top of which was a death's head. A man named Colden, whose place it was to serve out the stamps, had to flee to the fort, round which was placed a strong guard from a ship of war. The mob broke into his coach house, drew out his coach, put in it a form, stuffed and dressed to look somewhat like Colden, and marched up to the park, where they hung it on a tree. At night they took the form down, put it in a coach, and bore it back to Bowling Green, where the whole thing, coach and all, was burnt right in range of the guns of the fort where the King's troops were. In March 1766 the King drew back the Stamp Act, which gave great joy to those who had the good of America at heart, and to none more than to George Washington. But he made it known that he felt it to be his right as their king to tax them as he chose, and this hurt the pride of those who wished to make their own laws and be in bonds to no one. Washington, as did most of those who had English blood in their veins, looked upon that land as his home, and was loath to break the chain that bound him to it. But he did not think well of the Stamp Act, and saw what was sure to come to pass if the King pressed too hard on the Americans. On September 5th, 1774, a band of true men from all the states met for the first time in Philadelphia, and Washington set out from Mount Vernon on horseback to take his seat with them. With him were Patrick Henry and Edmund Pendleton, and as they rode side by side they talked of the land they loved, and of the hopes they had that all would be well. The band met with closed doors. Each man wore a grave face. Patrick Henry made a strong speech, at the close of which he said, "All America is thrown into one mass. Where are your landmarks? They are all thrown down." He said he did not call himself by the name of the state in which he was born, but by the name of the land which gave him birth, then known as the land of the free. Washington was not a man of words, but of deeds. But what he said was of great weight, as it came from a wise brain and a true heart. Patrick Henry said there was no man in the whole band so great as George Washington. The band broke up in November, and Washington went back to Mount Vernon, but not to the gay times and good cheer he once had known. George Fairfax, who had been his friend from boyhood, had gone to England to live, and Belvoir took fire one night and was burnt to the ground. The stir in Boston and in the West, where the redskins were on the war path, made the whole land ill at ease. Troops were kept on drill, and the roll of the drum was heard in all the small towns. Men came to talk with Washington, and to find out what he thought was the best thing to do, and the best ways to drill or to arm troops. It was of no use to plead with the King. He had made up his mind and would not yield an inch. A large force of the best men in Virginia met at Richmond, March 20th, 1775, and Washington was called on for some plan as to what their course should be. He told them that he thought there was but one thing to do. Patrick Henry put it into words that rang through the land. "We must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms, and the God of hosts is all that is left us." All hearts were full of zeal, and Washington wrote to his brother Augustine that if there was need of it, he would lead the troops to war, and risk his life and all his wealth in the cause, which seemed to him a most just one. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 8. The Battle of Bunker Hill. In the year 1775, war was rife in New England. The King's laws were felt to be more for slaves than for freemen, and all made up their minds to throw off the yoke. They could not bear the sight of the redcoats, and the King's troops were just as fierce in their hate of our men. Ships of war brought a large force of troops to New England, led by men of rank and fame. They filled the streets of Boston, and it was thought that they might bring the Americans to terms, and not a drop of blood be shed. But this was not to be. A large force of our men were in camp on the hills and fields near Boston, the sight of whom might well cause the well-clad British to smile. They had left their farms in great haste at the cry of "To arms!" had seized their guns and come in homespun clothes it was their pride to wear. Those from Massachusetts were led by General Artemas Ward, those from New Hampshire by Colonel John Stark, those from Rhode Island by General Nathaniel Greene, and those from Connecticut by General Israel Putnam, all brave and true men and full of fight. But the troops had need to be well armed, and all the guns and such things as there was need of in times of war were in Boston, where the redcoats were on guard. But though sharp eyes were on the watch, sly deeds were done by those who knew the ways in and out of each storehouse. Carts went out of town heaped high with dirt, in which guns and balls were hid, and all sorts of tricks were used to get such things past the redcoats. At length it came to the ears of General Gage that some field guns were at Salem, and he sent troops to seize them. But when they reached Salem, they found no guns there. The word came to General Gage that there was a large stock of arms and war stores at Concord, which was less than a score of miles from Boston. In the night of April 18th, the redcoats set out for Concord. General Gage had said that no one but the troops should leave the town. But the news was borne to Lexington, a town on the road to Concord, by those who were as swift as the hare and sly as the fox. The folks there met in groups, with hearts on fire. Bells were rung and guns were fired. Men who heard these sounds ran as fast as they could to Lexington to hold the bridge and keep back the foe. At 5 o'clock on the morn of April 19th, the redcoats came in sight, and at once 70 men stood out on the green near the wall to meet them. Major Pitcairn, who was at the head of the King's troops, called out to these brave men to lay down their arms and leave the place, but they paid no heed to his words. Then he sprang from the ranks, shot off a small gun, swung his sword in the air, and told his men to fire. The troops ran up with loud cheers and poured a storm of shot on our men, some of whom were killed. Then they pushed on to Concord and did all the harm they could at that place, spiked guns, threw pounds and pounds of shot down the wells, and spoiled a large lot of the flour and food that had been stored for use in time of need. When the King's troops turned back to Lexington, they were quite worn out with what they had done, and would have been cut down by our men if Gage had not sent a force to their aid. For the Bluecoats had flown to arms and poured into Lexington by all the roads that led thereto. The redcoats might laugh at their clothes and the way in which they tried to keep step, but they found out that they knew how to use guns, and that each man was a dead shot. The fresh troops Gage sent up from Boston had to form a square, so that the worn-out men who had had a long march and hard work might have a chance to rest. Then they all set out to march back to Boston, with 2 field guns in the rear to keep off the flock of Yankees, who dogged their steps and kept up a fire in front and rear and from each stone wall and hedge that lined the road. There was loss on both sides, but what hurt the King's troops the most was to be put to flight by such a lot of scarecrows as they thought our troops were. A close watch was kept on Boston by our men, who were soon in such force that it would not have been safe for the redcoats to try to leave the town. The King's troops did not like to be shut in this way, and lost no chance to mock at and taunt those who kept them at bay. On the north side of Boston lay a long strip of land, from the heights of which one could see the town and all the ships at or near the wharves. Putnam thought it would be a good plan to seize these heights and place troops there. But Ward and Warner thought it was not safe to risk it. It might bring on a fierce fight and cause much blood to be shed. Putnam had no fear of his own men. He knew how brave they were, and how well they could fight back of a screen. They had no fear of their heads, he said. Their chief thought is their legs. Shield them, and they'll fight on till doomsday. 2 or 3 of those who had led troops in the French war were of the same mind as Putnam, and their words had weight. The chief man was Colonel Prescott, who was just the style of man in port and in dress that a lot of raw troops would look up to. He wore a fine hat, a top wig, and a blue coat faced and lapped up at the skirts. He it was whom General Ward chose to lead the troops which were to seize the heights, build the earthworks there, and guard them from the foe. There were 1,200 in all, and they set out on the night of June 16th, 1775. Not a light was shown, not a sound was heard, but the tramp, tramp, tramp of these men on their way to face death. A small neck of land joined Charleston to the mainland, and as they drew near this the troops hushed their steps and moved with great care. For on this the redcoats kept a close watch. 5 of their ships of war stood so that their guns would sweep this neck of land, and earthworks were on Copp's Hill, which faced Charleston. On the bluecoats went, past the guards, past the guns, past the neck, and up to the heights of Bunker's Hill. Here they were to make their stand, but it was found that Breed's Hill, which was half a mile off, was not quite so steep, and would give them more of a chance at the redcoats, while Bunker's Hill would shield them in the rear. Putnam thought Breed's Hill was the right place, and was in haste from the work to go on. There was no time to lose, so pick and spade were brought out, and the earth dug out so as to serve as a wall to screen them from the fire of the foe. The night was warm and still. Now and then Prescott would steal down to the edge of the stream to see and hear if the redcoats had made a stir. There was not a sound save the cry of all's well, from the watchmen on guard in the town and on the ships of war. All night the work on the heights went on. At dawn of day the men there were seen by the seamen on the ships of war, and at once their guns were brought up and turned on the hill. Their shot did not harm the works, but one man who went outside was killed, and this threw the rest into a great fright. They were not used to scenes of war, and the sight of a man shot down in their midst was more than their nerves could stand. Some took to their heels at once and did not come back, and had Prescott not been a brave man himself, he could not have held his troops as he did. He stood up on top of the earthworks in full view of the redcoats, and talked with his men, and his words of cheer put new strength in their hearts, so that they were in less dread of the balls that whizzed near them. The noise of the guns roused the redcoats in Boston, and General Gage gazed at Breed's Hill like one in a dream. A fort full of men had sprung up in the night. How had it been done? What kind of men were these he had to meet? As he stood on Copp's Hill and looked through his field glass, he spied the tall form of Prescott in his blue coat on the wall of the fort. "Will he fight?" asked Gage. "Yes, sir," said one who stood near, and who knew Prescott. "He will fight to the last drop of blood, but I can't say as much for his men." "We must seize the works," cried Gage, and at once called up his chiefs for a talk, and to plan the best way to do this deed. The noise in the streets of Boston, the roll of the drum, the sound of the trump that calls to war, the sharp clicks of hoofs, and the deep roll of wheels that bore the field guns were heard on the heights, and let the troops there to know the war was at hand. The men were worn out with their hard task and their loss of sleep. They had not brought much food with them, and their thirst was great. The heat made them feel weak and dull. There was need of more men, and a lot of raw New Hampshire troops led by Colonel Stark came to their aid. In the meantime those on the height had to bear the fire of the guns from the ships and from Copp's Hill, which broke on them at 10 o'clock. At noon the bluecoats saw more than a score of boats full of troops cross from Boston in straight lines. The sun shone on their red coats and flashed from the tips of the guns they bore, and from the brass field guns that stood on the deck. It was a gay scene. They made their way to a point north of Breed's Hill, where General Howe, who led them, could see the full strength of the bluecoats. They had more troops than he thought, and he caught sight of fresh ones on their way to Breed's Hill. Howe at once sent to Gage for more troops and more balls for the field guns, and as it would take some time for them to be sent round, the redcoats in the meantime were served with food and drink. The grog was passed round in pails, and the men sat round on the grass and ate and drank their fill, while the poor men on the heights looked down and longed to share their feast. But while the redcoats took their ease, the bluecoats had a chance to add to the strength of their fort, and to push out the breastworks to a point known as the Slough. Near this was a pass where the foe might turn the left flank of the troops or seize Bunker's Hill. Putnam chose one of his men, a Captain Knowlton, to hold this pass with his Connecticut troops. He at once set to work to build a sort of fort, back of which his men could fight with more ease than if they stood out in the field. Not a long way off was the post and rail fence set in a low foot wall of stone. and this fence ran down to the Mystic River. The posts and rails of the fence near this were torn up in haste and set a few feet at the rear of it, and the space twixt the two was filled with new mown hay brought from the fields near at hand. While Knowlton and his men were at work on the fence, Putnam and his troops threw up the work on Bunker's Hill. In the meantime, Stark had set out from Medford on a 6-mile march. He was a cool, calm man, and had been through the French War, of which I have told you. He led his men at a slow pace, so that they would be fresh and strong to take part in the fight. As they came up to the neck, which they had to cross, and which was lined with guns on both sides, one of the aides urged him to let the men take a quick step. The old man shook his head and said, "One fresh man in a fight is worth 10 tired ones," and kept on at the same pace, and did good work that day back of the post and rail screen. Warren, who had been made a major general, came to serve in the ranks. Putnam said he might lead the troops at the fence. He said he did not care to lead. He was there to fight. "Where will the fire be the hottest?" he asked. He was told that the fort on Breed's Hill was the point the foe sought to gain. "If we can hold that," said Putnam, "the day is ours." Warren at once made his way there, and the troops gave a round of cheers when he stepped into the fort. Prescott, who was not so high in rank, sought to have Warren take charge of the troops, but he would not. "I have come to serve in the ranks," he said, "and shall be glad to learn from one so well skilled as yourself." The redcoats thought to take the works with ease and win the day. General Piggott, with the left wing, was to mount the hill and seize the earthworks, while General Howe came up with the right wing to turn the left flank of our men and stop all flight at the rear. Piggott and his men came up to the height, and not a gun was fired by our troops till the redcoats were in range. Then, as they were all good marksmen, each shot told, and some of the best men fell at the first fire. The foe fell back in haste, but were brought up once more by those who stood at their head with drawn swords. They were met by a fire more fierce than the first, and vexed by guns that bore on their flank from the band of men in Charleston. So much blood had been shed, and the men were in such a state of fright that Piggott was forced to give the word to fall back. We will now see what sort of luck General Howe had. He led his troops up the bank of the stream, and thought to take the slight breastwork with ease, and so get in the rear of the fort. But he did not know the ground, and could not bring his large guns through the swamp he met with. In the pause, some of his men were hurt and some killed by the guns that were set by the post and rail fence. Howe's men kept up a fire as they came on, but as they did not take good aim, the balls flew o'er the heads of our troops, who had been told to hold their fire till the redcoats were quite near. Some few did not do as they were told, and Putnam rode up and swore he would cut down the next man that fired ere he had the word to do so. When the redcoats were in the right range, such a storm of lead poured on them from guns in the hands of men who did not miss a mark that the place was like a field of blood. Such a host were slain that the redcoats lost heart and fell back in great haste. Some of them ran back as far as the boats and got on board of them that they might be safe from the fire of the marksmen. Once more the redcoats charged the fort, which it was their aim to get into their own hands. In the meantime the shells from Copp's Hill and the ships of war had set Charleston on fire. The town was built of wood, and was soon a mass of flames. The dense smoke put out the light of the sun. On all sides was heard the din of war. The big guns kept up their great roar. Bombshells burst in the air. The sharp hiss of the small balls and the shouts and yells of the men made a scene to strike the heart with awe. Our men stood firm, and with the eyes fixed on the foe, who, as soon as they were close at hand, were shot down by the guns whose aim was so sure. The redcoats stood the first shock, and then kept on, but they were met by such a stream of fire that they were soon brought to a halt. In vain did the men who led them urge them on with drawn swords. Whole ranks were mowed down. Some of General Howe's staff were slain, and the troops, wild with fear, broke ranks and fled down the hill. For a third time General Howe brought up his men, some of whom threw off their knapsacks and some their coats, that they may not be weighed down by them. The redcoats made a feint, as if they would take the fort at the fence, and did much harm there to our men. While some of his troops were at work at the point, Howe brought the rest of his force to the front and rear of the main fort, which was then stormed on three sides at once. Prescott told some of his men to stand at the back part of the fort and fire at the redcoats that showed themselves on the wall. Soon one leaped up and cried, "The day is ours," and was shot down at once, as were all those who had joined him. But our men had fired their last round, and there was naught for them to do but meet the foe in a hand-to-hand fight. With stones and the butt ends of their guns they sought to drive back the redcoats, but the tide was too strong for them, and they had to give way. Warren, who had done brave work that day, was the last to leave the fort. He scarce had done so ere he was struck by a ball and fell dead on the spot. As our troops fled by way of Bunker Hill, Putnam ran to the rear and cried, "Halt! Make a stand here! We can check them yet! In God's name, form, and give them one shot more!" But the troops could not be brought to a stand, and the redcoats won the day, but with loss of more than half their men, and it hurt their pride to think that it had cost them so dear to take these earthworks that had been thrown up in one night by a mere handful of raw troops. Their loss was 1,054. Our loss was 450. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 9. Commander-in-Chief. The deeds done ere this by the King's troops had made a great stir throughout the land. The chief men of each state met in Philadelphia, and sought out ways and means to help those who were in arms, as foes of King George, and a large force of men from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia were soon on hand to march and join the troops near Boston. But who was to lead them? The choice at once fell on George Washington, but he held back. He thought that Massachusetts troops might not care to be led by a man from the South, and General Ward, who was then at their head, had the first right, for Washington's rank was not so high as his. There was much talk on this score, and in the midst of it a Massachusetts man, John Adams, rose and said that the man he thought fit to lead our troops was in that room, and he came from Virginia. All knew who he meant, and as Washington heard his own name he rose from his seat and left the room. Then votes were cast, and all were for Washington, and he felt that he could not say no to such a call. He spoke his thanks in a few words, and said that he would do the best that he could, and serve without pay. He set out from Philadelphia, June 21st, 1775. With him were General Lee and General Schuyler, and a troop of light horse, which went all the way to New York. As soon as it was known that Washington was on the road, crowds ran out to meet him and to show their pride in him. When he reached New York, he heard of the fight at Bunker Hill, and made haste to join the troops in their camp at Cambridge. He reached there July 2nd. The next day all the troops were drawn out in line, and Washington rode out at the head of his staff till he came to a large elm tree. Here he wheeled his horse and drew his sword and took charge of all our troops as their commander-in-chief. He found much to do and much to bear from his own men as well as from the redcoats. It came to his ears that our men who fell into the hands of the redcoats at Bunker's Hill were not well used, and he wrote at once to Gage and asked him to be less harsh. Gage, who had fought by his side in 1753, when both were young men, wrote back that he thought he should have praise and not blame, since he had saved the lives of those who were doomed to be hung. Washington at first thought he would do as he was done by, but his heart failed him, and those of the redcoats that were in the hands of our troops were set free. If they gave their word, they would not fight for King George. By such acts, Washington sought to show that Americans are as merciful as they are brave. The camps in which Washington found his troops were as odd as the men themselves. Some of the tents were made of boards, some of sailcloth, or bits of both, while here and there were those made of stone and turf, brick and brushwood. Some were thrown up in haste and bore no marks of care, while a few were wrought with wreaths and twigs, and spoke well for the taste of those who made them. The best camp of all was that of the Rhode Island men, in charge of General Nathaniel Greene. Here were found as good tents as the redcoats had, and the men were well drilled and well dressed. Greene was brought up on a farm. His father was a blacksmith, and at times his son worked with the plow or took his place at the forge. At the first note of war, Greene left the farm, and in the month of May, 1775, was in charge of all the troops of his own small state. He went to Boston and took notes while there of all that the redcoats did, and in this way he learned much that he could put to good use. His troops had fought at Bunker Hill, and there were none in the whole force that bore themselves so well or made so fine a show. Greene was 6 feet tall, and not quite 20 years of age. He was strong and well built, and his frank way won the heart of Washington, and the two were warm friends from that time. Washington now set to work to add strength to the weak parts of his line, and to throw up fresh works round the main forts. All the livestock had to be kept off the coast so they would not fall into the hands of the foe. He sought to draw the redcoats out of Boston, but they would not stir. When Washington took charge of his troops, he thought he could go back to his home when the cold days came on and spend some time there with his wife. But there was no chance for him to leave. So he wrote to Mrs. Washington to join him in the camp. She came and stayed with him till the next spring, and this was her course all through the war. She came in her own coach and four, with her son and his wife. The black footmen were dressed in red and white, and the whole turnout was in the style in use in Virginia at that day. Washington had his rooms in the Craig House in Cambridge, and here Mrs. Washington took charge and gave the place more of a home-like air. At that time the camp of Cambridge was filled with all sorts of troops. Some had spent most of their lives in boats, some were brought up on farms, some came from the woods, and each group wore the dress that pleased them best, and laughed at those who were not dressed the same. This made sport for some time, and jokes flew thick and fast. One day some men came into camp dressed in an odd garb, such as was worn to hunt in. The suit was made of deerskin, and the long shirt had a deep fringe all round. This dress was the cause of much mirth to men who came from the seashore, and were used to short coats and rough plain clothes. There was snow on the ground, and when the jokes gave out, snowballs took their place, for a war of words is quite sure to end in blows. Men came up to the aid of both sides, fists were used, and all took part in the hand-to-hand fight, and there was a great stir in the camp. While the fight was at its height, Washington rode up. None of his aides were with him. He threw the reins of his own horse into the hands of the black men who rode near, sprang from his seat, and rushed into the thick of the fray. Then he seized two of the tall, stout huntsmen by the throat, and talked to them and shook them while he held them at arm's length. This put an end to the brawl at once, and the rest of the crowd slunk off in haste, and left but 3 men on the ground, Washington and the 2 he held in his grasp. As the cold days and nights came on, the men grew homesick, and longed to be by their own firesides. It was right that some of them should go, for they had served out their time, and this made the rest lonesome and sad. Songs would not cheer them, and they paid no heed to the words of those who sought to rouse them from the depths of woe. Washington was full of fears, which were shared by all those who were near him in rank. Yet he did not lose hope. General Greene wrote, "They seem to be so sick of this way of life, and so homesick, that I fear a large part of our troops will soon go home." Still his heart did not lose hope. All would come right in time, and his words of cheer were a great help to Washington at this time. The year 1775 had been a dark one for our land, and there was no ray of hope to light the dawn of 1776. There were but 10,000 troops to take the field. There was a lack of arms, a lack of clothes, and a lack of food, and these things made camp life hard to bear, and were a great grief to the heart of the chief. He could not sleep. Had the foe known of their plight, they would have borne down on them and swept them out of sight. But God took care of them. In the first month of the year there was a stir on the Boston wharves. A large fleet of boats lay in the stream, on board of which the redcoats swarmed, and there were 2 sloops of war filled with guns and warlike stores. All were in charge of General Howe, and Washington guessed what his plans were, and felt that the time had come for him to strive to wrest Boston from the King's troops. The outlook was bright. More troops had come to his aid, and he made up his mind to place part of his force on Dorchester Heights, and if he could, draw out the foe to fight at that place. At a sign, the troops on the heights and at Nook's Hill were to fire at the same time, and rake the town with balls and bombshells. At the same time, boats full of troops were to start from the mouth of the Charles River and act in the rear of the redcoats. It was thought that these moves on the part of our troops would bring on such a fight as they had on Breed's Hill. On the night of March 4th, our men made their way to the heights, and at dawn of the next day strong forts loomed up, and seemed as if they must have been brought there at the touch of a wand. Howe gazed on them and said, "The rebels have done more work in one night than my whole army would have done in a month." He must drive them from the heights or leave Boston. While pride urged him on, fear held him back, for he knew that his loss would be great. But he must make a move of some sort. So he made up his mind to send boats out that night with a force of troops in charge of Lord Percy. But a storm came up from the east. The surf beat high on the shore where the boats were to have land, and the scheme was put off till the next day. But it stormed just as hard the next day. The rain came down in sheets, and the boats stayed where they were. In the meantime, our men kept at work on the hills on the north side and south side, and when the storm ceased, General Howe saw that the forts were now so strong there would be no chance to take them. Nor was it safe for him to stay in Boston. Yet the admiral said that if Howe's troops did not seize the heights, the ships of war should not stay near Boston, so his lordship would have to leave with what grace he could, such as it might wound his pride. When word went forth that the troops were to leave, strange sights were seen in Boston town and bay. For some days the redcoats went this way and that in great haste. More than 70 boats were cast loose for sea, with at least 12,000 men on board of them. While this stir took place, not a shot was sent from the heights, and it was well that this was so, as the redcoats had laid plans to set the town in a blaze if our troops fired one gun. The redcoats left Boston March 17th, and our troops in charge of Old Put, as the brave Putnam was called, marched into town in fine style. For some days the fleet lay off the coast of Rhode Island, and it was feared for a while that they meant to strike a blow and win back what they had lost. But no such thing took place, and ere long the fleet sailed out of sight. "Where they are bound," wrote Washington, "and where they next will pitch their tents, I know not." He thought they were on their way to New York, but such was not the case. They had steered for Halifax to wait there for more troops, and for the large fleet that was to come from England. A vote of thanks and a large gold coin with his face on one side of it were sent to Washington by the chief men of the land, as part of his due for what he had so far done to save America from King George's rule. Washington, who thought the next move of the redcoats would be on New York, set out for that place, and reached there April 13th. He went to work at once to build forts and to send out troops, and to make the place as strong as it ought to be. He did not know the plans of the foe, nor from what point they would hurl the bolts of war. All was guesswork, but still in the midst of doubt it would not do to be slack. The town was put in charge of the troops, and the rules were quite strict. Those who went in or out had to give the password. "We all live here, shut up like nuns," wrote one who was fond of a gay life. "There's no one in town that we can go to see, and none to come see us." Good times in New York were at an end. Our troops had been forced to leave Canada, and it was known that the redcoats would push their way to New York. Forts were built on high banks up the Hudson and on the isles at its mouth, and all done that could be done to check them in their march. In the meantime, it had been thought a good plan to set a day in which it might be shown throughout the land that America was, and of a right ought to be, a free land. So in July an act was drawn up and signed by the wise men who met in Philadelphia to frame the laws for the new states. And there was great joy, for it was a great day. Bells were rung, shouts and cheers rent the air, fires blazed and hearts burned, and men knelt to pray and give thanks to God. John Adams said the 4th of July ought to be kept up with great pomp throughout America, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, and bonfires till the end of time. The news did not reach New York till July 9th, and at 6 o'clock that night Washington read the act to his troops. New York was wild with joy, and felt that more must be done than just to ring bells and light fires. In Bowling Green, in front of the fort, there stood a cast of George III, made of lead. This a mob of men pulled down and broke up, that the lead might be run into small shot and be used in the cause for which they fought. This did not please Washington, and he told his troops they must not take part in such deeds. The joy did not last long, for on July 12th the ships of war in the bay sent out a broadside, and it was thought they would at once fire the town. Crowds were on the streets. The troops flocked to their posts. Fear was in each heart, and New York was in a great stir. But two ships, the Phoenix and the Rose, left the fleet and shaped their course up the Hudson. Then the guns were still, and fear died out for a while. That night there was a fresh scare. Guns boomed, and clouds of smoke were seen near the ships of war down the bay. Men on the lookout told that a ship of the line had come in from sea, and each man of war gave her a round of guns as she passed by. At her foretop masthead she bore the flag of St. George. No need to tell more. "Lord Howe is come! Lord Howe is come!" was the cry that went from mouth to mouth, and the word soon flew through the town, and all felt that the hour of doom was close at hand. Lord Howe sought peace, and not bloodshed, and hoped, by the terms he would make, to bring not a few hearts back to their king, but he came too late. The king's troops did not think much of the rank that was borne by our men, who, they felt, had no right to put on the airs they did, and call themselves grand names. In a few days Lord Howe sent one of his men on shore with a flag of truce to seek speech with Washington. The man's name was Brown. His boat was met half way by a barge which had on board one of our troops named Reed, to whom Brown said he had a note for Mr. Washington. Reed said he knew no man of that name. Brown held out to him the note he had in his hand, which bore on its face George Washington, Esquire. Reed said that he could not take the note. He knew what was due to his chief, so there was naught for Brown to do but to take to his oars. He had not gone far when he came back to ask what style shall be used to please Here he caught himself and said, "Mr. Washington." Reed told him that Washington's rank was well known, and Lord Howe could be at no loss as to the right style. In a day or two the aide-de-camp came with a flag from Lord Howe, and asked if Colonel Patterson might have speech with General Washington. Reed, who met the aide, was prompt to grant this, and pledged himself that no harm should come to him who came in the king's name. So the next day Patterson came, and when he stood face to face with Washington, bowed and said, "Your Excellency." Washington met him with such form and state. He was not a vain man, but was proud of the rank he held, and thought that no man, were he a king, had a right to look down on America, or show the least slight to her commander in chief. When he came to hear the terms on which Lord Howe sought to make peace, he found they were not such as he could take. So the war went on.
End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 10. In and near New York. The Redcoats had a camp on Staten Island, and for the next month or so ships of war came that far up the bay, and brought with them a large force of troops. Northeast of them was the long stretch of land known as Long Island, where they could land their troops with ease and make their way to New York. Washington knew that he could not keep them back, but he meant to vex them all he could. General Greene was placed with a large force on Brooklyn Heights to guard the shore, and troops were sent a mile back to throw up earthworks to check the march of the foe if they should try to come up on the land side. At midnight of August 21st, a spy brought word that the king's troops were on the move, and would soon show their strength and put all to the sword. The next day the sound of great guns was heard, and a cloud of smoke was seen to rise from the groves on the south side of Long Island. Word soon came to New York that the king's troops were at Gravesend, and that our troops had fled and set fire to the stacks of wheat to keep them out of the hands of the foe. Washington at once sent off a large force to check the foe at Brooklyn, and to lend aid to those in the fort on the heights. He told them to be cool but firm, not to fire when the foe were a long way off, but to wait till they were so near that each shot would tell. And if one of them should skulk, or lie down, or leave his place in the ranks, he was to be shot down at once. Sir Henry Clinton led the king's troops, and Lord Cornwallis had charge of the field guns. Cornwallis made haste to seize a pass that ran through the hills, but found Colonel Hand there with a fine lot of marksmen, and so made a halt at Flatbush. This was so near New York that great fright spread through the town. Those who had the means left the place. There was good cause for fear, as it had been told that if our troops had to leave New York, it would at once be set on fire. This was false, but they did not know it. Their hearts were full of dread. General Putnam was sent to take the place of General Greene, who was sick in bed. The brave man was glad when he had leave to go, for he did not want to be kept in New York when there was a chance to fight for the land he loved. It was 9 o'clock on the night of October 26th that Sir Henry Clinton set out with his vanguard on his march from Flatbush. Lord Cornwallis brought up the rear guard with all the large guns and the large force of troops led by General Howe. Not a drum was heard, nor the sound of a trump, as they took their course through by roads and on causeways till they came near the pass through the Bedford Hills, where they made a halt. No guard had been put on the road or the pass by General Greene, who must have thought it too far out of the way to need such care. Clinton was quick to see this, and at the first break of day his troops were on the heights and within 3 miles of Bedford. In the meantime, scouts had brought word to our lines that the foe were in force on the right, and Putnam at once sent out troops to hold them in check. At daylight, small fights took place here and there. A brisk fire was kept up at Flatbush. Now was heard the big boom of a large field piece. Then a ship of war would send forth a broadside on the fort at Red Hook. Washington was still in doubt if this was part of the main fight in which New York was to share. 5 ships of the line tried to beat up the bay, but were kept back by a strong headwind. As the day wore on, and there were no signs that the redcoats meant to strike New York, Washington went to Brooklyn in his barge, and rode with all speed to the heights. He was just in time to see the fight in the woods, which he could do naught to stay. He stood on a hill, and through his large spy glass had a view of the whole field. He saw his men cut their way through a host of foes. He saw them caught in traps and hemmed in so that they were twixt 2 fires. The whole pass was a scene of blood, and through it rang the clash of arms, the tramp of steeds, the storm of shot, and the cries of men who fought for their lives. On this side and that our troops were swept down or put to rout by a force they had not the strength to meet. Washington wrung his hands at the sight. "Good God!" he cried, "what brave men I must this day lose!" The redcoats went into camp that night in front of our lines, but out of reach of the guns of the fort. Our loss was 3,000, theirs less than 400. The next day New York Bay and the small isles were wrapped in a dense fog, from which New York was quite free. Here was a chance for the troops to leave the works on the heights and make their way to New York. Fresh troops were sent down from Fort Washington and King's Bridge, and Washington felt that no time should be lost. His fear was that the King's ships would come up the bay at the turn of the tide, sail up the East River, and catch in a trap all our troops that were on Long Island. It was late at night when the troops stole out from the breastworks. In the dead of night a big gun went off with a great roar that gave a shock to the nerves of those who were in dread that the least sound might warn the foe of their flight to the New York side. But no harm came of it. The fog shut out the view, and by daybreak our troops had all left the fort and were safe on the New York side. Washington, who had not slept for 2 days and nights and had spent most of the time on horseback, would not step into the boat till he saw all his troops were on board. The fog rose as the rear boats were in midstream, and when the redcoats climbed the crest of the earthworks they found not a sign of life there, and not a thing they could use. Our men had made a clean sweep, and were proud of the way in which they stole a march on the redcoats. Still, New York was not safe, and Washington sought in all ways to find out the plans of the foe. Ships of war went up the Sound and up the Hudson, and guns were fired on the forts that lay on each side of the town. But he knew that if the redcoats took New York, they would soon be made to give it up, and so he made up his mind that his best course was to withdraw his troops to Harlem Heights. This was done with the loss of a few men who had a fight with some redcoats on the way, and there he stayed a few days and spent much time on horseback. He took note of the land and chose sites for forts and breastworks, and on October 23rd took his stand at White Plains, where a strong fort was built. Soon the din of war was heard. The guns from Fort Washington and Fort Lee poured their fire on the men of war, but could not keep them back, and the redcoats still gave chase to our troops. Fort Washington fell into the hands of the foe in spite of a strong fight made to hold it. One day Washington went out with some of his staff to look at a height at the north where it was thought he might make a stand, and leave the camp where he then was. One of them said, "This is the ground where we ought to be." "Let us go then and view it," said Washington. They were on their way to the place when a horseman rode up in haste and cried out, "The redcoats are in camp, sir." "Then," said Washington, "we have something else to do than this," and at once put spurs to his horse and set off for the camp at full speed. When he reached there he found all his troops drawn up to meet the foe that was close at hand. In his calm way he turned to those who had been out with him on the hills and said, "Go back to your post and do the best you can." A short, sharp fight took place, in which our troops made a brave stand, but the redcoats were too strong for them, and drove them back to the camp, and seized the hill on which they had stood. That night the troops of Washington and Howe lay not far apart. Washington kept his men at work, and forts were built, and earthworks thrown up. These works were made of the stalks of corn or maize, which the men took from a field near at hand. The roots of the stalks, with the earth on them, were placed on the face of the works, in the same way that sods of grass and logs of wood were used. The tops were turned in, and loose earth was thrown on them so that they were held in place, and made a good shield from the fire of small arms. The next day, when Howe saw how much had been done by our troops to add to their strength, he made a change in his plans. His own men were in a sad plight, and not fit to cope with the well-fed troops that kept them at bay. The nights were cold, the fall rains set in, and not a few of the redcoats were ill. Their chiefs knew how to fight in straight lines, but were not so shrewd and so quick to make use of what lay at hand as our chiefs were. So he broke up his camp, and in a few days the whole force of redcoats fell back from White Plains. But the strife was kept up at the north, and the foes were at work on sea and on land from New York to Albany. Our troops met with ill luck, and Washington was filled with grief. Fort Washington was in the hands of the foe. Fort Lee was of no use, and the next move of the redcoats was to cross the Hudson north of Fort Lee, and to make their way through New Jersey. By that means they could shut in all our troops twixt the Hudson and the Hackensack. Washington at once sent off his men to save the bridge at Hackensack. No time was to be lost. They left the camp with all haste, but ere they could reach the Hackensack, the vanguard of the foe was close at their heels. It was thought that a fight would take place, but Cornwallis turned back, and some of his troops slept that night in the tents that our men had left. These were dark days. Washington led his troops through New Jersey, hard pressed by Cornwallis, whose vanguard came into Newark just as Washington's rear guard had left it. His whole camp were in flight. He stayed a few days at Brunswick, in hopes that fresh troops would be sent to his aid, but none came, though his needs were so great. The men who, as he thought, would seize their guns and join his ranks fled from their homes and sought a safe place as soon as they heard that the redcoats were near. On December 2nd, Washington was at Trenton, where he made but a brief halt. Then he crossed the Delaware and left New Jersey in the hands of the foe. If he and his men once got to Philadelphia, they would find troops there with whose aid they might hope to turn back the redcoats so close on their track. General Lee, who was at the heels of the foe, was at Morristown December 11th, where his troops had been forced to halt for 2 days for want of shoes. He was a man who loved his ease and to lie late in bed. One day, as he sat at a desk with pen in hand, one of his aides named Wilkinson, who was with him, looked down the lane that led from the house to the main road and saw a band of redcoats on horseback. He cried out to Lee, "Here are the redcoats!" "Where?" said Lee. "Round the house." "Where is the guard?" said Lee with an oath. "Where is the guard? Why don't they fire?" The guards had not thought it worth while to keep watch, when his chief was so much at his ease, so they had stacked their arms and sat down on the south side of the house to sun themselves. As the horsemen came up, they gave chase to the guards, who fled for their lives, and left Lee and his aide to do the best that they could. The redcoats drew near the house where Lee was, and swore that they would set fire to it if the general showed fight. So he was forced to yield, and was brought out in great haste, for they wished to make sure of their prize, and placed on Wilkinson's horse, which stood at the door. He was but half dressed, had no hat on his head, and wore low shoes, and a loose rough coat. In this style he had to ride to New Brunswick, where the king's troops, at sight of him, set off their big guns, for their joy was great. The loss of Lee was thought at the time to be a great blow to our cause, as it was hoped that he would do much to bring the war to an end, and to lead the troops out of their sore straits. In the meantime, Washington was on his way to cross the Delaware. There was snow on the ground, and much of the troops could be traced by the blood spots from the feet of those whose shoes were worn out. The redcoats were in force at Trenton, in charge of a man named Rall, who had done brave work for King George at White Plains and Fort Washington. Washington's plan was to add to his force, and as soon as he could, cross the Delaware and strive to wrest Trenton from the hands of the foe. He and his force were to cross the stream 9 miles north of the town. General Ewing was to cross with his troops a mile south of the town, and General Putnam to leave at a point south of Burlington. It was a bold scheme, full of risk to all who took part in it. Yet there was naught to be done but to push on and hope for the best.
End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 11. A Sad Year. Christmas night was the time set to cross the Delaware, and at sunset the troops were on the move. It was a dark, cold night. The wind was high, the tide strong, and the stream full of cakes of ice which drove the boats out of their course. It seemed at times as if the boats would be crushed to bits. Men who were used to boats, and had been brought up on the sea and fought with fierce storms and wild gales, found it hard work, with all their skill, to make their way from shore to shore. Washington, who crossed with the troops, stood on the east bank till all the field guns were brought to land, and it was 4 o'clock ere the men took up their line of march. Trenton was 9 miles off, and they could not reach there till daylight, too late to take the king's troop off their guard. Most of the troops at Trenton were Hessians from Hesse, a small German state whose prince had lent his troops to King George for hire. As I have told you, they were in charge of Rall. Rall thought more of his brass band than he did of his men, was full of good cheer, and liked to have a good time. He would sit up till a late hour in the night, and then lie in bed till 9 o'clock the next day. The one who leads troops to war should be like a watchdog, quick to see and to hear all that goes on, and to be on guard at all times. Each day he had the guns drawn out and dragged through the town, just to make a stir and have the band out. But when the major told him that he should have earthworks thrown up on which to place the guns, he said, "Pooh, pooh! Let the foe come on. We'll charge on them with the bayonet." "But, Herr Colonel," said the old major, "it costs not much, and if it does not help, it will not harm." But Rahl laughed, as if he thought it a good joke, turned on his heel and went off, and the works were not thrown up. On this night, too, there was a great stir in the camp at Trenton, for the men did their best to keep Christmas, and their thoughts were of home and the dear ones there. They made what cheer they could, and did not dream that the foe was so near. A storm of hail and snow set in as soon as our troops took up their march. They could scarce see their way through the sleet they had to face. The night was so cold that 2 of the men froze to death. At dawn of day some of the men came to a halt at a crossroad, where they did their best to dry their guns. But some were past use, and word was sent to Washington of the state of their arms. They were in doubt what to do. Washington, in a burst of rage, bade the men to go back to his chief at once and tell him to push on and charge if he could not fire. At 8 o'clock Washington drew near the town at the head of his troops. He went up to a man who had come out to chop wood by the roadside and asked him where the guard was who stood out. At 8 o'clock Washington drew near the town at the head of his troops. He went up to a man who had come out to chop wood by the roadside and asked him where the guard was who stood at the outpost of Rahl's camp. The man said in a harsh voice, "I don't know." "You may tell him," said one of our men who stood near, "for that is General Washington." At once a great change came o'er the man to whom Washington spoke. He raised his hands and cried, "God bless you! God bless you!" and then showed where the guards could be found. Soon was heard the cry from Rahl's men, "The foe! The foe! Turn out! Turn out!" Drums beat to arms. The whole place was in a stir. Washington came in on the north, Sullivan on the west, and Stark at the south end of the town. Rahl scarce knew how to act. He rode to the front of his troops and got them out of the town. Then he seemed to feel that it was a shame to fly in that way, for he was a brave man. So he led his men back in a wild dash out of the woods and into the town to meet the foe. In the midst of the fight a shot struck him, and he fell from his horse. The troops would heed no voice but that of their chief, and fled up the banks of a creek on the way to Princeton. Washington saw the stir and thought they had wheeled to form a new line. He was told that they had laid down their arms, and his joy was great. The day was ours. But for the wild flight of Rahl's men, it would have gone hard with our troops. Washington did not know it at the time, but he found out that Ewing and Putnam had tried to cross the stream, but were kept back by the ice, and he with his raw troops would, he was sure, have been put to rout had Rahl and his men been on their guard. The poor major, who had in vain urged Rahl to throw up breastworks, had a bad wound of which he died in Trenton, and Rahl himself, to whom the redcoats owed their ill luck, was laid to rest in a graveyard in that town. And where was General Howe all this time? In New York, where he thought to take his ease till the Delaware froze so that his troops could cross. He was much shocked at the news that the Hessians, who had been brought up to war, should have laid down their arms for a troop of raw men in rags. He sent Lord Cornwallis back to take Jersey, and as he said, to bag the fox. By the 3rd of January, redcoats, with Cornwallis at their head, were near at hand. Washington was in a tight place, with a small creek twixt his few raw troops and the large force of the foe. Back of him lay the Delaware, which it was now not safe to cross. In this dark hour a gleam of hope came to his mind. He saw a way out of the trap, and that was by a quick night march to get at the rear of the King's troops, dash on the camp at Princeton, seize the stores that were left there, and push on to New Brunswick. A thaw had set in which made the roads deep with mire, but in the course of the night the wind veered to the north and in 2 hours the roads were once more hard and frost-bound. That the foe might not guess his plan, Washington bade some of his men to keep at work with their spades on their pits near the bridge, go the rounds, change guards at each bridge and ford, and keep up camp fires till daybreak, when they were to join those on the way to Princeton. In the dead of night Washington drew his troops out of camp, and the march took place. The road which they had to take was cut through woods, and the stumps of trees made the march a slow one, so that it was near sunrise when Washington came to the bridge at the brook 3 miles from Princeton. As our troops left the woods, they came face to face with a force of redcoats, and a sharp fight took place, which did not last long. Washington was in the midst of it. In the heat of the fight, his aide-de-camp lost sight of him in the dusk and smoke. The young man dropped the reins on the neck of his horse, drew down his cap to hide the tears in his eyes, and gave him up for lost. When he saw Washington come out of the cloud with his hat raised and the foe in flight, he spurred up to his side. "Thank God you are safe!" cried he. "Away, and bring up the troops," said Washington. "The day is our own." At daybreak, when General Howe thought to bag his fox, he found the prize had slipped from his grasp, and soon learned that the King's troops had lost their hold on New Jersey. The fame of Washington and of the brave deeds of those who fought to be free went across the sea and made friends for him and the cause. Not a few came to their aid. One of these brave souls was a Pole, whose name was Kosciuszko. The commander-in-chief said to him, "What do you seek here?" "To fight for the cause you have at heart." "What can you do?" "Try me." This style of speech and the air of the man pleased Washington so well that he at once made him an aide-de-camp. This was in 1777. He served the cause well, and went back to his own land in 1786 with the rank of brigadier general. In 1777 Lafayette came from France to join the troops led by Washington. He had wealth and high rank in his own land, and had lived but a score of years. He left his young wife and the gay court of France, and made his way to America to do what he could to aid the foes of King George. He came, he said, to learn and not to teach, and would serve without pay, and as one who came of his own free will. He soon won his way to the heart of Washington, and a strong bond of love grew up twixt the two which naught but death could break. In the meantime the whole of our land south of the Great Lakes was a scene of strife and bloodshed, and it was hard work for our troops to keep the redskins and redcoats at bay. I have not space to tell you of all the fights that took place, nor the ways in which Washington sought to vex the King's troops. On the 3rd of October of this year, 1777, we find him at Germantown, where the main force of the redcoats were in camp. His plan was to drive them out, but though his troops fought with much skill, and in the midst of a dense fog, they were forced back, and the day was lost. The ships of war in the Delaware led Washington to think that Lord Howe meant to turn his guns on Philadelphia, and his mind was filled with doubts and fears. In the same month word came to him that Burgoyne, who was at the head of the King's troops in the north, had been forced to yield to General Gates at Fishkill. This was such a blow to the King's cause that the troops at West Point and elsewhere on the Hudson, who were to have gone to the aid of Burgoyne, left the forts and made their way to New York.
End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 12. Foes in the Camp. It is much worse to have one foe in the camp than to have a host of foes outside. For who can tell what harm he may do who comes in the guise of a friend? In the year 1774, a young man named John Andre came with the King's troops and fought in their ranks at St. John's and Crown Point. He had a brave heart and a fine mind, and did much to keep up the hearts of the men when in the camp. He was fond of the fair sex, and had praised in rhyme the charms of a Miss Shippen, who wed Benedict Arnold in the year 1780. Arnold had fought well on our side at the North, and won much praise. He had been a seaman in his youth, and was both strong and brave, but he grew proud and vain, and sought to rank as high as the Commander in Chief, with whom he found much fault. Washington had great faith in him, and did not dream he was false at heart. For some ill deeds while at Philadelphia, Arnold had been brought to court and tried, and his guilt proved, and this had made him wroth with Washington and the cause he had sworn to aid. He sought for a way to pay back the slight and raise himself to fame. With this end in view he wrote to Sir Henry Clinton, but did not use his own name, that he would like to join the cause of King George on the terms that he had set forth. He was in need of funds, for he was deep in debt, but Clinton did not see fit to make use of him. 2 or 3 more of his schemes failed, and at last he asked that he might have charge of the post at West Point. This Washington gave him, and in August Arnold fixed himself in a fine house that stood on the east side of the stream, half a mile or so south of West Point. From this place he sent notes to André, the aide-de-camp of Clinton, who wrote back and signed his name John Anderson. Arnold's plan was to throw West Point and the Highlands into the hands of Sir Henry Clinton at the time that Washington was at King's Bridge, and the English troops in New York. A fleet with a large land force on board was to come up to the Highlands, and Arnold would at once yield up the post into their hands. This act, he thought, would bring the war to an end, with the flag of King George at high mast, and then great would be the name and fame of Benedict Arnold. That the scheme might not fail, Arnold wrote to André to meet him at Dobbs Ferry, September 11th at noon. But Arnold had spent the night of the 10th at Haverstraw, on the west shore, and on his way back in his barge, as he had no flag, he was fired on by the guard boats of the King's troops. So he had to put off his plans for a day or 2. In the meantime the sloop of war Vulture, a good name for such a bird of prey, was brought up the Hudson so as to be near at hand to aid in the vile scheme. On September 18th, Washington, with his suite, crossed the Hudson at Vanderplank's Point in Arnold's barge, on his way to Hartford. Arnold went with him as far as Peekskill, and talked with him in a frank way, as if he were most true to the cause. André went up the Hudson on the 20th and went on board the Vulture, where he thought to meet Arnold. But Arnold knew it would not be safe for him to be there, so he kept in the background. The next night a boat crept up to the side of the Vulture, in which were 2 men. Their oars scarce made a sound. André, who wore a blue greatcoat, went on board this boat and was rowed to the west side of the stream. 6 miles south of Stony Point they came to a shore at the foot of a high mount known as Long Clove. It was midnight. Dark was the hour, and dark the place, and dark the deed. Arnold was there, hid in the shade of the woods. A man was near who came to wait on him and take care of his horse. He and André had a long talk. 1, 2, 3 hours passed, and still there was more to say. One of the men who had brought André, and whose name was Smith, warned them that it was near daybreak, and the boat would be seen by our guards if they did not go back soon. Arnold feared that the sight of a boat on its way to the Vulture might bring harm to him and his scheme, so he urged André to stay on shore till the next night. The boat was sent to a creek up the Hudson, and André, on the horse that Arnold's man had rode, set off with Arnold for Smith's house. The road took them through the small town of Haverstraw. As they rode on in the dark, the voice of one of the guards at an outpost made André start, for he knew he must be within our lines. But it was too late to turn back, and at daybreak they reached Smith's house. Scarce was the door closed on them when the boom of great guns was heard from down the stream. André felt ill at ease, and had good cause for fear. The fact was that as soon as Livingston, who had charge of our troops at Vanderplank's Point, heard that the Vulture was within shot of Teller's Point, which juts out twixt Havershaw Bay and Tappan Sea, he sent some men and some big guns to that point in the night to fire on the sloop of war. André kept a close watch on the scene from a top room in Smith's house. At one time he thought the Vulture was on fire, but his heart gave a throb of joy when he saw the sloop of war drop down the stream out of reach of gunshot. Arnold gave André the plans of the works at West Point, and told him what and how he was to do. As the Vulture had changed her place, he told André it would be far more safe for him to go back to New York by land, and he would reach there in less time. But André said that he must be put on board the sloop of war the next night, and in case he should change his mind, Arnold gave him a pass that he might go by sea or by land. At 10 o'clock that morn Arnold left him to his fate. Time moved at a slow pace with poor André. Once on board the Vulture he would be safe. His task would be done, and West Point would soon be in the hands of the redcoats. As night set in he grew still more ill at ease, and asked Smith how he had planned to get him on board the Vulture. It gave him a shock to learn that Smith had not done the least thing. The boatmen had gone home, and he would not take him on board the Vulture, but he said he would cross the Hudson with him and start him on the road to New York by land, and go some of the way with him on horseback. They set off at sunset, and went for 8 miles on the road to White Plains, when they were brought to a halt by a band of our troops, who were out as watchmen. André showed his pass signed with Arnold's name, and so they took him for a friend and not a foe. He wore a coat of Smith's that made him look like a plain man. The two were warned that it was not safe for them to be on the road at night, as they might meet the cowboys from the King's troops, who but a short time since had swept through that part of the land. Smith was full of fears, and André had to yield to his wish to take a bed in a farmhouse near at hand. This they did, but André could not sleep. He knew that he was not safe. At daybreak he woke Smith and made him haste to leave the place. 2½ miles from Pine's Bridge on the Croton River, André and Smith took a scant meal at a farmhouse which had been stripped by the cowboys. Here Smith took leave of André, who was to go the rest of the way to New York alone. He felt no fear now, as he had passed our lines and was clear of those who kept watch on the outposts. 6 miles from Pine's Bridge he came to a fork in the road. The left branch led to White Plains. The right branch led to the Hudson. He had thought at first that he would take the left-hand road, as the right one was said to be filled with cowboys. But he had naught to fear from them, as he was on their side, and as it was a more straight road to New York, he turned down it and took his course on the banks of the Hudson. He had not gone far when he came to a place where a small stream crossed the road and ran down a dell that was thick with trees. A man stepped out with a gun and brought André to a stand. 2 armed men came up to aid the first one, whose name was Paulding. Paulding's coat was in rags, and was of the kind that was worn by the King's troops. When André caught sight of it, his heart leapt for joy, for he was sure he was safe, so sure that he did not guard his tongue. He asked the men if they were on his side, and they said they were. He then told who he was, and that he had been sent to a post up the Hudson and was in haste to get back. As he spoke, he drew out a gold watch, such as few owned in those days, and none but men of wealth. Think what a shock it must have been to André when Paulding said they were not his friends but his foes, and he was in their hands. Then André tried to make out what he first told was a lie, but that he would now tell the truth, and he drew forth his pass to prove that he was all right. Had he done this in the first place, he might have gone on his way. A still tongue shows a wise head. The men seized his horse by the rein and told André to get off. He warned them that he had been sent out by General Arnold, and that they would be ill dealt with if they held him back. "We care not for that," they said, as they led him through the shrubs on the edge of the brook. Then they went to work to search him, and took note of the way in which he was dressed. They were poor men, and had not had a chance to see such fine clothes. André wore a round hat, a blue greatcoat, neath which was a red coat decked off with gold lace, a nankeen vest, small clothes, and boots. They made him take off his coat and vest, and found naught to prove that he had sought to harm their cause, and they had a mind to let him go. Paulding, who had been twice in the hands of the redcoats and ill used by them, was still not quite free from doubt. A thought came to his mind. "Boys," said he, "his boots must come off." At this André's face flushed, and he said that his boots were hard to get off, and he begged that he might not lose time in this way. But the men were firm. They made him sit down. His boots were drawn off, and the plans that Arnold gave him were brought to light. Paulding looked at them and cried out, "He is a spy!" He then asked André where he had got these plans. "From a man at Pine Bridge," he said, "a man whom I did not know." As he put on his clothes, André begged the men to let him go. He would pay them a large sum and stay with two of the men while one went to New York to get it. Here Paulding broke in, "Keep your gold. We want none of it. Were it 10 times as much, you should not stir one step." André had to yield to his fate, and was led by the men to our post, which was 10 or 12 miles off. André rode on horseback with one man in front and one at each side. At noon they came to a farmhouse, and those who dwelt there sat at the midday meal. The housewife, whose heart was touched by a sight of André's youth and look of grief, asked him to draw near and take some of the food. Then, as she caught sight of his gold-laced coat, the good dame said that she knew it was poor fare for such as he, but it was the best she had. Poor André shook his head and said, "Oh, it is all good, but indeed I cannot eat." When the four reached the outpost and Jameson, who was in charge, saw the plans that had been found on André, he at once saw that they had been drawn up by the hand of Benedict Arnold. He at once did the thing he ought not to have done, which was to write to Arnold and tell him that a man who said his name was John Anderson had been caught and held, though he bore a pass signed by him. The plans found on him had been sent to the commander in chief, and André, with a strong guard, was sent with a note to Arnold. In a short time Major Talmadge, who was the next in rank to Jameson, came back from a trip to White Plains. He had a clear head, and as soon as he heard the case he at once urged Jameson to send a man in haste to bring André back. This was done, but Jameson had not thought to have a note to Arnold brought back, so it sped on to let the knave know that his plot had failed. As soon as Arnold read the note, he sprang on the horse of the man who brought it, and rode with all speed to the dock where his 6-oared barge lay moored. He threw himself into it and bade his men pull out in mid-stream and row as fast as they could to Teller's Point, as he must be back in time to meet Washington, who was then on his way to West Point. The guards knew his barge, so they did not fire on it, and a bit of white cloth waved in the air served as a flag of truce. He soon was on board the Vulture, where he gave himself up, and the coxswain and 6 bargemen with him. This was a mean act, and showed just what kind of man Arnold was, but as soon as the men made it known that they had been led to think that all was all right, and that a flag of truce gave them a safe pass, they were at once set free. Arnold gave the redcoats much aid, and they were glad to make use of him, but they did not care to make friends with so base a man. At the close of the war he went to England, and made his home there. He was shunned by all, and died in the year 1801 at the age of 60. As Washington drew near the fort at West Point, he thought it strange that no guns were fired. "Is not General Arnold here?" he asked one of the men who came down to the shore to meet him. "No, sir. He has not been here for 2 days past, nor have I heard from him in that time." This was strange, but soon the note from Jameson was placed in his hands. When he had read of the deep laid scheme, he said with a deep sigh, "Whom can we trust now?" Word was at once sent out to the guards to check Arnold's flight, but it was too late. He had slipped from their grasp. Let us now see how André bore his hard fate. He had the best of care and made hosts of friends, who grieved that one so young, so well bred, and of such high rank should have done a crime for which he must be hung. It was a great grief to Washington, who would have felt no pang had Arnold been in André's place. But death to the spy was one of the rules of war, and on October 2nd was the day set for André to be hung. He had asked that since it was his lot to die, he might choose the mode of death, and he begged that he might be shot. This Washington could not grant, though in his heart he longed to do so, but thought it best that André should not know. On the morn of the 2nd, André dressed himself with great care, in the full suit worn by those who bore his rank in the King's troops. He was calm, while all those near him were in tears. He walked with a firm step to the place where he was to end his life, arm in arm with two of our troops. When he caught sight of the rope he gave a start, and asked if he was not to be shot. When told that no change could be made, he said, "How hard is my fate, but it will be but a brief pang." Then he stepped into the cart, took off his hat and stock, loosed his shirt at the throat, put the noose round his neck, and bound his own eyes. When told that there was a chance for him to speak if he chose, he said, "I pray you to note that I meet my fate like a brave man." Then the cart was moved off, and he was left in mid-air, and death took place in a short time. André was laid in a grave near the place where he was hung, but in 1821 was borne to the land of his birth, and placed near the tombs of kings and queens. He that breaks laws must pay the price. If you want to make friends, and to have them love and trust you, be true. Let no one coax you to sin. The eye of God is on you, and he sees all your deeds. You may hide your crime for a while, but you may be sure your sin will find you out. Be not an Arnold, nor an André. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 13. The Hardships of War. We will now go back to the place we left, and see where Washington was at the close of the year 1777. He had been forced to leave New Jersey in the hands of the King's troops. His own troops were worn down by long and hard toil, and had need of rest. They were in want of clothes, too, and could not keep warm in the tents, so he sought out a place where they could build huts and screen themselves from the cold winds and storms. He chose Valley Forge, which was on the west bank of the Schuylkill River, and a score of miles from Philadelphia. Sad was the march of the troops to Valley Forge. Food was scant, their clothes were worn out, and a track of blood marked the way they trod. They had fought hard, but did not win, and this made their hearts low. On December 17th they reached Valley Forge, and had to freeze in their tents till they could cut down the trees and build the huts they were to live in. The walls were 6 feet and a half high, and were made of logs filled in with clay. The roofs were made of logs split in half. No pen can paint the hard lot of those poor men shut in at Valley Forge. For some days they had no meat. For 3 days they had no bread. Some of the men had to sit up all night by the fires, as there were no clothes for their beds, and they could not sleep for the cold. Some of the men were so scant of clothes that they could not leave their huts. Washington was kept short of funds and of troops, though he pled hard for both, and was sore pressed on all sides. He scarce knew what to do. There was but one thing he could do, and that was to wait. While his troops were in this sad plight, some of them sick unto death, the redcoats who held Philadelphia in siege led a gay sort of life, and were much at their ease. Near the 1st of March a German came to Washington's camp to lend him his aid. His name was Baron Steuben. He had fought for long years in the wars that had been waged in Europe, and had been aide-de-camp to Frederick the Great, and had won much fame by his brave deeds. The French, who were friends to our cause, knew that we had need of such a man as Baron Steuben, and urged him to come to America, and he was at once sent to join the troops at Valley Forge. Our troops had had no chance to drill. There was no one to teach them, and they had fought with a rush and a dash, and in a pell-mell sort of way. Steuben went to work to drill these men, the best of whom had much to learn, and he found it a hard task at first, as he could not speak our tongue. At last a man was found who spoke French, and him Steuben made his aide-de-camp and kept him close at hand. The men were slow to learn, for the drills were new to them, and Steuben would get wroth with them and call them blockheads and all sorts of hard names. But though he had a sharp tongue, and was quick to get in a rage, he had a kind, true heart, and soon won the love of the men. For 8 months the redcoats had held Philadelphia. In the spring General Howe went home and left his troops in charge of Sir Henry Clinton, who made up his mind to lead the troops back to New York. But he did not wish his plans to be known. In the meantime Washington knew that a scheme of some sort was on foot, so he sent troops out to check the King's troops should they move by land. The redcoats left Philadelphia on June 18th, and as there was but one road for them to take, their train stretched out for 12 miles. They made a halt at Allentown, and Clinton had not quite made up his mind which way to go from that place. He at first thought he would go as far as the Raritan River, and then ship his troops to New York. But when he found that our troops were not far off, he turned to the right and took the road to Monmouth. His march was a slow one. The heat was great. The rains made the roads bad, and they had to stop to bridge the streams, and to build causeways so that they could cross the swamps. Washington in the meantime had gone on to Kingston, but as soon as he learned Clinton's course, he moved his troops so as to get in the rear of the redcoats. On the night of June 27th, the foe went in camp on the high ground near Monmouth Courthouse. The vanguard of our troops was 5 miles off and in charge of General Lee. At daybreak the vanguard of the redcoats set forth down the hill, while Clinton with his choice troops stayed in camp on the heights of Freehold, to give the long train of carts and pack mules a chance to get well on the way. At 8 o'clock all were in line of march to Middletown. As soon as Lee heard that the foe were on the move, he set out to meet them, and was joined by the troops in charge of Lafayette. As Lee stood on one of the hills, he caught sight of a band of redcoats hid somewhat by the woods, which he thought was part of the main force. So he sent some of his troops to draw their fire and check them in the rear, while he, with the rest of his force, would take a short cut through the woods, get in front of the corps, and cut it off from the main force. Washington was on his way with his main force, when the boom of big guns rang out on the air. The sound caused him to change his pace to a quick step, and when he drew near Freehold Church, where the road forked, he sent Greene with part of his force to the right, while he, with the rest of the troops, took the left-hand road. Washington stood on the ground with his arm thrown up on the neck of his horse, when a man rode up and said the bluecoats were in flight. Washington was vexed, for he was quite sure it was not true. Then came one with fife in hand, quite out of breath, and in great fright. He was seized at once, so that he would not scare the troops then on their way, and told that he would be flogged if he dared to spread the tale he had brought. Washington sprang on his horse and sent men out to learn the truth, while he spurred past the Freehold Church. The news seemed too strange to be true. He had heard but a few guns, and did not think there had been much of a fight. Was Lee to blame for this wrong move? He feared so. As he reached the high ground he saw Lee and his men in full flight, and by this time he was in a fine rage. "What do you mean by this?" he asked in a fierce, stern tone as Lee rode up to him. At sight of Washington's face, Lee was struck dumb for a while, but when he could speak he tried to tell why he thought it best to fall back. There was not much time for a talk, as the foe was not far off. The sight of their commander in chief put a stop to the flight, and plans were at once made to turn the luck. The place where they were was good for a stand, as it was on high ground which the foe could not reach but by a causeway. Lee knew that Washington had lost faith in him, so he held back, and would give no aid to his chief. Washington rode back to Lee in a calm mood, and said to him, "Will you keep command on this height or not? If you will, I will go back to the main force and have it formed on the next height." Lee said it was all the same to him where he was placed, that he would do just as Washington said, and not be the first to leave the ground. Soon guns were heard on both sides. Lee and his men, who were in the foreground, made a brave stand, but were at length forced to fall back. Lee brought off his troops in good style, but the causeway that crossed the swamps in front of our troops in charge of Lord Stirling was the last to leave the ground. When he had formed his men in line back of the swamp, he rode up to Washington and said, "Here, sir, are my troops. What do you wish me to do with them?" Washington saw that the men were worn out with long tramps, hard fights, and the great heat, so he told Lee to take them to the rear, and call in all those he might meet with who had fled from his ranks. The foe sought to turn both our flanks, but were checked by a sharp fire, and at length they gave way and fell back to the ground where Lee had been that morn. Here the woods and the swamps were on their flanks, and their front could not be reached but by the causeway. Great as was the risk, Washington made up his mind to charge on the foe, and this was his plan. General Poor was to move round on their right, General Woodford on the left, while the big guns shall gall them in front. But night set in ere they could act on this plan. Some of the troops had sunk on the ground, and all were in need of rest. Washington told them to lie on their arms just where they had chanced to be when it grew dark, as he meant to go on with the fight at dawn of the next day. He lay on his cloak at the foot of a tree, and Lafayette lay near him. At daybreak the beat of drums roused them from their sleep, but the foe had fled, and had been so long on the way that Washington could not hope to check them. Our loss in the fight at Monmouth was 69, while 250 of the King's troops were left dead on the field. Some of the troops on both sides had died in the swamp, and some were found on the edge of a stream that ran through it, where, worn out with their toils, and weak from heat and thirst, they had crawled to drink and die. Lee's pride had been so hurt that he wrote to Washington in a way that he should not have done to his commander in chief, and he was brought to court by the Board of War and tried for his wrong deeds. His guilt was proved, and he was told that he could not serve for the next 12 months. He went to his home in Virginia, where he led a queer kind of life. His house was a mere shell, and had but one room, but lines were chalked on the floor, and each space was used as if it was a room by itself. Here was his bed, there were his books, and in this space he kept all his horse gear, and in that one he cooked and ate his meals. With pen and with tongue he strove to harm Washington, whom his shafts failed to hurt, and who spoke not an ill word of Lee. He liked him as a friend, but did not think he was fit to lead troops to war. Lee died in the course of 4 years, and on his deathbed he thought he was on the field of war, and his last words were a call to his men to stand by him. For a year or two more the strife was kept up on the coast from Maine to Florida, and both redcoats and redskins took part in scenes that chill the blood to read of. Houses were burnt and land laid waste. Forts were stormed and seized from our troops, whose force was too small to hold them. Now and then there was a gain for our side, but in spite of his ill luck, Washington held on with a brave heart, and would die at his post, but would not yield. In the first part of the year 1780 we find Washington in camp at Morristown, with a lot of half-fed and half-clad troops. No such cold had been known in this zone. The Bay of New York froze so hard that the ships of war that lay in it were icebound. Food was scant, and there was a lack of firewood. Washington saw what a chance there was for a bold stroke, but he had no funds with which to fit out his troops or to move them to the coast. The cost of war was great, and the gold was scarce. He could not strike a big blow for New York to wrest it from the hands of the foe, as he might have done at this time had his troops been well fed and well clad, but he would do what he could in a small way. A bridge of ice had formed twixt New Jersey and Staten Island, so Washington sent Lord Stirling with 2,500 men to start up and seize a force of 1,200 redcoats. His lordship crossed in the night, but was seen and had to fall back to Elizabethtown. Some of his men fell into the hands of the King's troops, and some into the hands of Jack Frost. This raid gave a start to the foe, and they set out to tease and vex our outposts, which they thought could be done at small risk, as there was snow on the ground and the troops could be borne on sleighs. Not far from White Plains, and a score of miles from the outpost of the redcoats, 300 of our men had a post in a stone house known as Young's house, and that was the name of the man who owned it. It faced a road which ran north and south down through a rich plain, and so on to New York. Our men kept a close watch on this road to stop the redcoats who might seek to pass with food or livestock. The redcoats made up their mind to break up this nest of bluebirds, and the night of February 2nd was set for the task. The King's troops set out from King's Bridge, some in sleighs and some on horseback. The snow was deep, and it was hard for the sleighs to break their way through. The troops at length left them and marched on foot. They could not bring their field guns with them. Now and then they would come to a place where the snow was more than 2 feet deep, and they had to take byways and crossroads so as not to get near our outguards. The sun rose while they were yet 6 miles or more from Young's house. This spoiled their plan, but still they kept on. Ere they could reach the house, the news flew like wildfire that the redcoats were near, and men left their farms and homes to aid those in Young's house. But though they fought well, they had not strength to hold the fort. Not a few were killed. The house was sacked and set on fire, and the redcoats made haste to get back to their lines with those of our men whom they had seized, and who were sent to New York and put in the vile jails there. In the year 1780, France sent ships of war and troops to aid our cause, and to drive the redcoats from New York. The French troops were in charge of Count de Rochambeau, who was told to do just as Washington said, for he was commander-in-chief. Washington's heart gave a throb of joy at this proof of good will, and his grief was that he had not more troops of his own to join with these, that he might push for New York at once. He must wait till the rest of the French troops, then on their way, came to port. In the meantime his thoughts were turned to the south, where the redcoats, led by Cornwallis, waged a fierce war. Our troops there were in charge of General Greene, who was full of cheer and did his best to keep the foe at bay, but with poor luck, as his force was small. But Washington had faith in him, yet such a large force of the King's troops had been sent by sea to aid Cornwallis that Washington feared that Greene would not be safe. So he wrote to Lafayette, who was on his way to meet the French fleet that had been sent to the Chesapeake Bay, to push on and join the troops at the south. At this time Washington was at a place near West Point, and his whole force on the Hudson in May 1781 was not more than 7,000, half of whom were not fit to take the field. Here word came to him of feuds at the north, and that the foe were in force on the north side of Croton River. Colonel Delancey, who led this raid, held the place that André had filled, and bore the same rank, and Delancey's horsemen were the dread of all those who dwelt in that part of the land. Our troops had an outpost not far from Pine's Bridge, in charge of Colonel Greene of Rhode Island, who had served all through the war. Delancey set out at night at the head of 100 men on horseback and 200 on foot. They crossed the Croton at daybreak, just as the night guard had been called off, and bore down on the outpost. They first went to the farmhouse where Colonel Greene and Major Flagg slept, and put a strong guard round it. Major Flagg sprang from his bed, threw up a sash, and fired at the foe, but was shot through the head and then hacked with sword cuts and thrusts. Then they burst through the door of Greene's room. He was a man of great strength, and for some time kept the foes at bay with his sword, but at last he fell, for what could one man do in such a fight? By the time the troops sent out by Washington reached the post, Delancey's men had flown. They tried to take Greene with them, but he died on the way, and they left him at the edge of the woods. Washington felt sad at heart when he had heard of the death of his brave and true friend, Colonel Greene, and the next day he had his corpse brought to the west bank of the Hudson. Guns were fired to tell that one who had fought well had gone to his rest, and strong men shed tears as he was laid in his grave, for his loss was a source of great grief to all.
End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 14. The Close of the War. In the month of May, Cornwallis had planned to bring his troops to Petersburg and strike a blow at Lafayette, who was near Richmond. Lafayette fled as soon as he heard that Cornwallis had crossed the James River, for he had but few troops and did not care to bring on a big fight till the men came up who were then on the way to aid him. Cornwallis thought he could soon catch the boy, as he called him, but his youth made him spry, and the redcoats did not get up to him. On June 10th, General Wayne came up with 900 men to add to Lafayette's strength, and this made him change his whole plan. With 4,000 men and Baron Steuben, he might hope to win in a fight with the redcoats, and he turned his face to the foe. Cornwallis was at the time twixt Lafayette and Albemarle Courthouse, where stores were kept. The Marquis, by a night march through a road that had long been out of use, got in front of the King's troops and held them in check. Cornwallis turned back and marched first to Richmond and then to Williamsburg, while Lafayette kept close in his rear. Here they had a fierce fight, in which the loss was great on both sides and the gain but small. At this time word came to Cornwallis that Washington had borne down on New York, and that he must send some of his troops to that town. This would leave him too weak to stay where he was, so on July 4th he set out for Portsmouth. Lafayette gave chase the next day and took post 9 miles from his camp. His plan was to fall on the rear guard when the main force should have crossed the ford at Jamestown. But Cornwallis guessed what he meant to do and laid a trap for him. A sharp fight took place, into which Wayne threw himself like a madman. But the foe were as 10 to 1, and our troops were forced back to Green Springs. In July, Lafayette wrote to Washington that Cornwallis had left Portsmouth by sea, and he thought he was on his way to New York. It was true the troops had gone on board the boats, but though wind and tide were fair, they did not sail. With the French fleet to help him, Washington saw a chance to fight the foe by land and sea. So he turned from New York and marched to Virginia to aid Lafayette, who longed to have his chief at the head of his troops, but did not know he was so near. As our war-worn troops went through Philadelphia, they were hailed with shouts and cheers from the throngs that filled the streets. They kept step to the sound of the drum and fife, and raised a great cloud of dust, for there had been quite a drought. The French troops passed through the next day, but were not in the same style. They made a halt a mile from the town, where they brushed off the dust from their guns and their gay white and green clothes, and then marched with a light step to the sound of a fine band. Crowds were on the streets, and bright smiles and loud shouts met these who had come from France to lay down their lives, if need be, for the cause we had at heart. When Washington turned his back on New York, Sir Henry Clinton sent word to Cornwallis that he would not need the troops he had asked for, so Cornwallis went from Portsmouth to Yorktown, where he took his stand. Yorktown was a small place on the south side of York River. The stream at this point was not more than a mile wide, but it was so deep that ships of large size and weight could go through. Here he threw up works on both sides of the stream, which gave him a fine stronghold, as the banks were high and set out from the mainland. He thought there was no foe near but Lafayette, and had no great fear of one so young. He felt so safe that he wrote to Clinton that he could let him have a large force of men to add strength to New York, where it was thought our troops would strike the next blow. In the meantime, Lafayette threw out troops to the rear to work with the French fleets that would soon be in Chesapeake Bay, and so a net was drawn round Cornwallis at a time when he thought he was most safe. Washington was at Philadelphia on September 5th, and at Baltimore 3 days from that time. He left Baltimore on the 9th at daybreak, with but one of his suite, as he was in haste to reach Mount Vernon. The rest of his suite rode at their ease, and joined him the next day at noon. It was 6 years since Washington had seen his old home, and how full of toil and care those years had been. In 3 days he had to leave the dear old place, and with his guests push on to join Lafayette, who was at Williamsburg. By September 25th, the French and our troops were in camp near that town, and at once set to work to get things in train for the next fight. Cornwallis had built forts on the north and south banks of the stream, and had done all he could to add strength to Yorktown. Ships of war were in front, and boats had been sunk at the mouth of the stream. Field works were at the rear with big guns on top, and there were long rows of trees that had been cut down and left so that their limbs stuck out and made a fence it would not be safe to climb. At the right and left of Yorktown were deep dells and creeks, and it was not strange that Cornwallis felt that he was in a sure stronghold. Our troops were 12 miles off when they took up their march on September 28th, and that night they went in camp 2 miles from Yorktown. Washington and his staff slept on the ground, his head on the foot of a tree. The next morn our troops drew out on each side of Beaver Dam Creek, the Americans on the east side and the French on the west. The Count de Grasse with the main fleet stayed in Lynn Haven Bay so as to keep off the ships that might come from sea to aid the redcoats. On the night of the 1st of October, our troops threw up 2 earthworks on which the redcoats turned their guns at daylight and killed 3 of the men. While Washington stood near the works, a shot struck the ground close by him and threw up a great cloud of dust. One of his staff who stood near was in a great fright, but Washington was calm and showed no signs of fear. On October 6th, our troops set out to dig the trench that the first line would use in the siege of Yorktown. So dark was the night, and so still were the men, that the foe did not know of it until daylight. Then they fired on them from the forts, but the men were screened and kept at their work. By the 9th the trench was dug and the guns fixed to fire at the town. Washington put the match to the first gun, and a storm of balls and bombshells dared Cornwallis to come out and fight. For 3 or 4 days the fire was kept up on both sides, and bombshells crossed in mid-air, and at night flashed forth like great stars with tails a blaze of light. Our shells did much harm in the town and to the earthworks of the foe. The red-hot shot from the French forts northwest of the town reached the King's ship of war. The Sharon, a 44-gun ship, and 3 large boats for troops were set on fire by them. The flames ran up to the tops of the masts, and as the night was dark the scene was a grand one to the eye, but a sad one to the heart. On the night of the 11th a new ditch was dug by the troops led by Baron Steuben, and for 2 or 3 days the foe kept up a fire on the men at work. At 8 o'clock on the night of October 14th, they set out to storm both Yorktown and the point on the north bank at the same time. The vanguard of our troops was led by Alexander Hamilton. When at school, he wrote to one of his boy friends, "I wish there was a war," and in 1776, when he was all but 19 years of age, he was placed at the head of the men who fired the guns and bombshells. The next year he was aide-de-camp to Washington, in whom he found a true and wise friend. With great joy and pride Hamilton led the van in a headlong dash past the trees, which they pushed or pulled down with their own hands, where they could not climb them, and was the first to mount the wall. One of his men knelt so that Hamilton could use him for steps, and the rest of the men got up the best way they could. Not a gun was fired, and the fort fell into the hands of our troops with a small loss on both sides. The French stormed the fort at the point in as brave a way, but with less speed, and lost more men. Washington stood on the ground in the grand fort, where he could see all that took place. An aide-de-camp near him spoke up and said that he ran a great risk from a chance shot through one of the portholes. "If you think so," said Washington, "you can step back." Soon a ball struck the gun in a porthole, rolled on, and fell at his feet. General Knox seized him by the arm. "My dear General," said he, "we can't spare you yet." "It is a spent ball," said Washington in a calm voice. "No harm is done." When each charge was made and both forts were in our hands, he drew a long breath, turned to Knox and said, "The work is done, and well done." Then he said to his black man, "Bring me my horse," and rode off to see where next his lines should move, and how the trap could be closed on Cornwallis. Cornwallis found that he could not hold his forts. No troops had come to his aid, and he would soon have to yield to the foe. This was too much for his pride, so he made up his mind to leave those who were sick or had wounds and fly from Yorktown. His scheme was to cross the stream at night, fall on the French camp ere daybreak, push on with all speed, and force his way to the north and join Sir Henry Clinton in New York. A large part of his troops had crossed the stream on the night of October 16th, and the rest were on their way when a fierce storm of wind and rain drove the boats down the stream. They could not be brought back till daylight, and it was then too late for them to move on or turn back. The hopes of Lord Cornwallis were at an end, and on the 17th he sent a flag of truce and a note to Washington and asked that his guns might cease their fire for one day so that terms of peace could be drawn up. Washington feared that in the meantime troops from New York would reach Cornwallis, so he sent word back that his guns would cease their fire for but 2 hours. Washington did not like the terms drawn up by Cornwallis, so he made a rough draft of such terms as he would grant. These were sent to Cornwallis on the 19th, and he was forced to sign them, and in 2 hours his troops were to march out of the forts. At noon our troops were drawn up in 2 lines more than a mile in length, the Americans on the right side of the road, the French on the left. At 2 o'clock the redcoats passed out with slow steps, and were led to a field where they were to ground their arms. Some of them, in their rage, threw down their guns with such force as to well nigh break them. On the day that Cornwallis had been forced to lay down his arms at Yorktown, the large force that was to aid him set sail from New York. They did not reach Chesapeake Bay till October 29th, and when they found they were too late, they turned their prows and went back to New York. The downfall of Cornwallis was felt to be a death blow to the war, and a great joy was felt throughout the land. Votes of thanks were sent to Washington, to de Rochambeau, and to de Grasse, and Washington gave high praise to all the troops for the way in which they had fought at the siege of Yorktown. From that time the redcoats lost heart, and on November 25th, 1783, they marched out of New York, and Washington marched in at the head of his brave men, who had fought and bled and borne all the ills that flesh could bear, that the land they loved might be free. In a few days Washington was called to Annapolis to meet with those who had made the laws, and his chief men, who had been with him through all the sad scenes of the war, came to bid him good-bye. With a heart full of love he said to them, "I cannot come to each of you to take my leave, but shall be glad if each of you will come and take me by the hand." This they did. No one spoke a word. Tears were in all their eyes. Washington left the room and went on foot to the boat which lay at the end of what was then and is now Whitehall Street. His friends kept close in the rear. When Washington was in his barge he turned, took off his hat, and waved good-bye, and those on shore did the same, and watched the barge till it passed out of their sight. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 15. First in Peace. At the close of the war and of the year 1783, Washington went back to Mount Vernon. He reached his home to his great joy on the eve of Christmas Day, and he was in a good state of mind to keep the feast. "The scene is at last closed," he wrote, "and I am eased of a load of care. I hope to spend the rest of my days in peace." Mount Vernon was locked in ice and snow for some time. Washington wrote that he was so used to camp life that he could not help feel when he woke each day that he must hear the drums beat, and must go out to plan or to lead his troops. He was now at his ease, and longed for the spring so that his friends could come to him. "My way of life is plain," he said. "I do not mean to be put out of it, but a glass of wine and a bit of meat can be had at all times." He would not give notes of his life to those who wished to write it up at this time, lest it should look vain. "I will leave it to those who are to come to think and say what they please of me," he wrote. "I will not by an act of mine seem to boast of what I have done." As spring came on, friends flocked to Mount Vernon, and Washington met them in a frank way. His wife, too, was full of good sense and good cheer. She loved to knit, and had been used all through the war to knit socks for the poor men who were in the ranks. But as Washington took his rides through his place, he felt the changes there since he had left. Old friends were gone, and the scenes of his youth were no more. Lafayette spent a few days with him,
And the love he felt for the brave young man was as strong as at first.
he wrote a sad note to him when he was gone, which showed what a warm place the young Frenchman had in his heart. He said, "As you left me, I asked if this were the last night I should have of you, and though I wished to say no, my fears said yes. I called to mind the days of my youth, and found they had long since fled to come back no more. I must now go down the hill I have climbed all these years. I am blessed with strength, but I some of a short lived race, and may soon go to the tomb." All these thoughts gave a gloom to the hour in which I parted with you. Washington made a trip through some of the states of the West, and saw there was a chance for great trade there. He wrote much of what he had seen, but his chief joy was in his home and land, where he planted trees and loved to watch them grow. He writes down each month of what he sets out. Now it is a choice slip of grape vine from France, or it may be a tree that stays green all year round. Some of the bushes he set out still stand strong in their growth on the place. He notes the trees best for shade,
And which will not hurt the grass.
he writes of rides to the mill swamp in quest of young elms, ash trees, and white thorn, and of the walks he lays out and the trees and shrubs he plants by them. A plan of the way in which he laid out his grounds is still kept at Mount Vernon, and the places are marked on it for the trees and shrubs. He owned 5 farms, and he kept maps of each. He read much of soils, the way to raise good crops, and the best style of plows and farm tools to use. He rode the first half of the day to see that all went well. When he had dined, he would write till dark if he had no guests. If friends came, he did all he could to make them feel at ease and at home. He was kind and loved by all. He would not talk much of the war nor of what he had done in it. He took great care not to talk of his own acts, so that if there had been a guest who did not know the facts, he would not have found out by a word from Washington that he was one who had won a great name in the eyes of the world. Though grave in his looks and ways, he loved to see youth glad and gay. He was fond of the dance, and it was long the boast of more than one fair dame
That she had danced with the chief.
there had been balls in camp in the dark days of the war. Washington, as we have seen, had been fond of the hunt in his youth, and Lafayette sent him some hounds from France, so he took up his old sport. But the French hounds did not do well, and he found they could not be trusted. Ere the war had been long past, it was found that there was need of new laws by which the states should be ruled. The chief men of the land were called to Philadelphia to form them, and Washington went from Mount Vernon to take part in the work. It was then that the code of laws was drawn up which bears the name of Constitution of the United States. These laws said that the states should be ruled by a president. The choice for this post fell on Washington, and in the spring of 1788 he bade good-bye to Mount Vernon and made his way to New York, where he was to take the oath that he would serve the land and be true to her in peace and in war. As he passed through the towns, crowds came out to cheer him, flags were raised, guns roared, and at night there was a great show of fireworks. When he came to Trenton, the place where in the past he had crossed the stream in the storm, through clouds of snow and drifts of ice, he found a scene of peace and love. Crowds were on the bank, the stream gleamed in the sun, the sky was blue, and all hailed him with joy. On the bridge that crossed the Delaware, an arch was raised and twined with wreath of green and gay blooms. As Washington passed 'neath it, a band of young girls, dressed in white and with wreaths on their heads, threw bright blooms at his feet, and sang an ode that spoke the love and praise that were in all hearts. At Elizabethtown Point he was met by men who had been sent from New York, and led to a barge which had been made for his use. It was filled with seamen of high rank, who made a fine show in their white suits. Boats of all sorts, gay with flags and some with bands on board, fell in the wake of Washington's barge, and as they swept up the bay of New York, the sight was a grand one. The ships at the wharves or in midstream dipped their flags and fired their guns, bells were rung, and on all the piers were great crowds that made the air ring with their shouts. On the last day of April, 1789, Washington took the oath in front of the hall where the wise men of the land had been wont to meet in New York. He stood in full view of a great crowd to whom this was a new and strange sight. The states were to be as one, and this man, whose name and fame were dear to them, was to pledge himself to keep them so. On a ledge that bulged out from the main part of the house was a stand spread with a rich red cloth, on which lay the Word of God, the Book of Books. Washington was clad in a full suit of dark brown home-made cloth, white silk hose, and dress sword with steel hilt, and his hair was dressed in the style of the day. As he came in sight, he was hailed with the shouts of the crowds in the streets and on the roofs. He came to the front of the ledge close to the rail so that he could be seen by all, laid his hand on his heart, bowed 3 or 4 times, and then went back and took his seat in an armchair near the stand. In a short time he rose and went once more to the front with John Adams, who was to be next him in rank, and the friends who were to stand by him in this new field. While the oath was read, Washington stood with his hand on the Word of God, and at the close he said, "I swear, so help me God." One of the men would have raised the book to Washington's lips, but he bent his head and kissed it. Then there was a cry of "Long live George Washington!" and all the bells in the town rang out a peal of joy, and the crowd rent the air with their shouts and cheers. Washington bowed and made a speech that was full of good sense. Then all went on foot to St. Paul's Church to pray that God would bless the land. Washington felt most of all, as he wrote to his friends, a fear lest he should come short of what the land hoped to find in him. The eyes of the world were on him. He had won fame in the field, but how would he rule the state? There was still much to be done. Great Britain held some of the posts at the West, on the plea that debts due to some of her men had not been paid. The red men were still a source of fear to the homes in the Wild West, and there was no hard cash with which the states could pay their debts. He found that his time was no more his own. From dawn till dark men came to him, and he saw that he must be saved from this, or he could do no work. Mrs. Washington joined him, and soon days were fixed for the calls of friends. The house was kept well, but there was no waste. One who dined there wrote that there was no show. The President said a short grace as he sat down. 1 glass of wine was passed to each, and no toasts were drank. He was kind to his guests, and strove to put them at their ease. He was strict in the way he kept the Lord's Day. He went to church, and he would have no calls on that day. As to Mrs. Washington, those who knew her at the time speak of her as free from all art. She met her guests in a well-bred way, as one who had ruled in a great house. She, too, was more fond of their home at Mount Vernon than of the new rank and place. To stay at home was the first and most dear wish of her heart. Washington was touched to the quick when he heard that someone had said that there was more pomp at his house than at St. James, where King George held his court, and that his bows were much too stiff and cold. Washington wrote, "I grieve that my bows were not to his taste, for they were the best I can make. I can say with truth that I feel no pride of place, and would be more glad to be at Mount Vernon with a few friends at my side, than here with men from all the courts of the world." He then goes on to tell how they treat their guests. At 2 or 3 o'clock each Tuesday they come and go. They go in and out of the rooms, and chat as they please. When they first come in they speak to me, and I talk with all I can. What pomp there is in all this I do not see. The red men, who could not be kept in peace, roused the land once more to arms. Washington did not wish for war, but he had to call out troops. They went forth and laid waste Indian towns. Washington thought it would be a good plan to meet the Indian chiefs and talk with them. 3 chiefs came to him and said that they would go to the rest and try to make peace. Washington made a set speech and told them it would be a good work to do, or else those tribes, if they thieved and killed as they had done, would be swept from the face of the earth. He had thought much of the state of the red men in the land. He had but small faith in the schools for the youth, save as far as to teach them to read and write. The true means to do them good, he thought, was to teach them to till the ground and raise crops in the same way as the white folks. And he said if the tribes were pleased to learn such arts, he would find a way to have them taught. In the end, General St. Clair had to be sent out with troops to put the red men down. Washington's last words to him were to be on the watch, for the redskins were sly and would wait for a chance to find him off his guard. But St. Clair did not pay heed to these wise words, and the redskins got into his camp. Some of his best men were slain, and the whole force was put to rout. When the news was brought to Washington, he said in a quick way, "I knew it would be so. Here on this spot I took leave of him and told him to be on his guard. I said to him, 'You know how the redskins fight us.' I warned him, and yet he could let them steal into his camp and hack and slay that army." He threw up his hands and his frame shook as he cried out, "Oh, what a crime! What a crime!" Then he grew calm and said that St. Clair should have a chance to speak, and he would be just to him. St. Clair was tried and was found free from guilt. Washington's mother died at Fredericksburg, Virginia, August 25, 1789, aged 82. When her son first went to war, she would shake her head and say, "Ah, George should stay at home and take care of his farm." As he rose step by step and the news of his fame was brought to her, she would say George was a good boy, and she had no fear but that he would be a good man and do what was right. In the year 1789 a great war broke out in France, in which Louis XVI lost his crown and his head, and deeds were done that you could scarce read without tears. Men seemed like fiends in their mad rage, and like wild beasts in their thirst for blood. In 1793 France made war on England, and in 1797 sought to break up the peace of the United States. But of this I will tell you by and by. In the meantime the 4 years, which was the full term Washington was to rule, came to an end. He had no wish to serve for 2 terms, but the choice fell on him, and he once more took the oath on March 4, 1792. In 1796, as France was still at war, it was thought best that Washington should hold his place for a 3rd term. But this he would not do. He made up his mind to leave these scenes and to give up that sort of life, and those who pled with him could not move him. He took leave of his friends in a way that moved them to tears, and his farewell speech, though in plain style, touched all hearts and made them feel what a loss it was to part with so great and good a man. On March 4, 1797, John Adams took the oath and bound himself to serve as President for a term of 4 years. Washington was there, and as he rose to leave the house there was a great rush to the door, as all wished to catch the last look of one who had for so long a time the first place in their hearts. So great was the crush that it was feared there would be loss of limbs, if not of life. As Washington stood in the street, he waved his hat as cheer on cheer rose from the crowd, and his gray hairs streamed forth in the wind. When he came to his own door, he turned to the throng with a grave face and tried to say a word or two. But tears rose to his eyes, his heart was full, and he could not speak but by signs. He soon set off for Mount Vernon, the dear home of his heart. He had been there but a few months when the French, by their acts, seemed to want to bring on a war with the United States. They took our ships at sea, and there was no way left but to stand up for our rights. President Adams wrote to Washington, "We must have your name if you will let us have it. There will be more in it than in a host of men. If the French come here, we shall have to march with a quick step." Washington wrote to President Adams, "I had no thought that in so short a time I should be called from the shade of Mount Vernon. But if a foe should come in our land, I would not plead my age or wish to stay at home." He saw the dark clouds that showed a storm, and he feared his days of peace would be few. It was with a sad heart that he felt his rest was at an end. But he had so strong a sense of what was right that he did not hold back. He said he would do all he could for the troops, but he would not take the field till the foe was at hand. For months Washington led a life full of hard work. He had much to do for the troops, and at the same time work at home. He would write for hours, and took long rides each day. To his great joy there was, in the end, no war with France. He seemed in first rate health up to December 12, 1799. On that day a storm set in, first of snow, then of hail, and then of rain, and Washington was out in it for at least 2 hours. When he reached the house, his clerk, Mr. Lear, saw that the snow hung from his hair, and asked him if he was not wet through. "No," said Washington, "my great coat kept me dry." But the next day his throat was sore and he was quite hoarse, and though much worse at night, he made light of it and thought it would soon pass off. When he went to bed, Mr. Lear asked him if he did not think it best to take something. "Oh, no," said Washington, "let it go as it came." But he grew worse in the night, and it was hard for him to breathe, and though his wife wished to call up one of the maids, he would not let her rise lest she should take cold. At daybreak, when the maid came in to light the fire, she was sent to call Mr. Lear. All was done that could be done to ease him of his pain, but he felt himself that he had but a short time to live. Mr. Lear was like a son to him, and was with him night and day. When Mr. Lear would try to raise and turn him so that he could breathe with more ease, Washington would say, "I fear I tire you too much." When Lear told him that he did not, he said, "Well, it is a debt we must all pay, and when you want aid of this kind, I hope you'll find it." His black men had been in the room the whole day and most of the time on his feet, and when Washington took note of it, he told him in a kind voice to sit down. "I tell you these things that you may see what a kind heart he had, and how at his last hour he thought not of himself." His old friend Dr. Craig, who stood by his side when he first went forth to war in the year 1754, was with him in these last hours, when death was the foe that Washington had to meet. He said to Dr. Craig, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go. My breath cannot last long." He felt his own pulse and breathed his last on the night of December 14th, 1799. His wife, who sat at the foot of the bed, asked with a firm voice, "Is he gone?" Lear, who could not speak, made a sign that he was no more. "'Tis well," she said in the same voice. "All is now at an end, and I shall soon join him." Thus lived and died this great and good man, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of those who loved the land of the free. Praise did not spoil him or make him vain, but from first to last he was the same wise, calm, true friend, full of love to God and of good will to men. Great and good men have been born into the world, but none of those whose name and fame rank as high as that of George Washington.
End of chapter 15. End of The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.